Hey there and welcome back. If you are already in bed, lights low, the day behind you, then let your mind drift, just for a moment, away from wherever you are tonight to a long Highland valley running east through the granite country of Aberdeenshire on an evening late in September of 1868. The hills on either side, dark with Scots pine to halfway up their flanks and then bare, the heather past its bloom and rusted now to copper. The Dee, salmon water clear and cold off the high Cairngorms to the west. The air cool as the September dark comes down, carrying peat smoke from the cottage chimneys, the green damp of birch leaves not yet fallen, the dry sweet smell of heather past its flower, the wind in the tops of the pines, a long whisper that has not stopped since the trees began to grow. The bellow of a stag in his autumn rut somewhere on the high ground above the loch. The light leaving the side of Loch Nugger a quarter of an hour earlier each night, and the valley folding itself in for another evening. And set back from the river on the south bank, a castle of pale grey granite with a tower at its southwest corner and lighted windows along its ground floor. The castle is 12 years old. It was built by a German prince who fell in love with the place and who has been dead for almost 7 years. The woman at the writing desk behind one of those lighted windows is the most famous woman alive. She is 49. She has been Queen of the United Kingdom for 31 years. You do not need to picture anything difficult tonight. You only need to let your mind rest, very gently, inside the granite walls of the castle she built with her husband and never stopped coming home to. Before we go any further, if you have not yet subscribed to the channel, please do. One of the loveliest things for me is reading where people are listening from in the comments. And tonight in particular, I would like to know, because the Highlands of Scotland have, for almost 2 centuries now, been the place that English-speaking people the world over have looked to as the cosy retreat from everywhere else. The Queen herself made it so. The Highland romance that the rest of the British Empire spent the latter half of the 19th century inhabiting in stories and prints and tartan and shortbread tins was a thing she very nearly invented by going there twice a year and writing about it. Wherever you are listening from tonight, the chances are high that the Highland imagination has reached you in one of its forms: a tin of biscuits in your grandmother's kitchen, a picture of a stag in a hotel corridor, a tartan rug, a piper at a wedding, a film with a castle and a deer. Tell me in the comments where you are and which of these you grew up with, and I will picture you and the Highland trace that reached you and how it got there from the granite castle we are about to step inside. So, tonight we are doing something the historical record makes both possible and remarkable. We are going to spend an evening in the company of Queen Victoria at Balmoral on a Wednesday late in September of 1868, from the late tea of the afternoon through to the moment she lays down her pen in bed and goes to sleep. From the lighting of the lamps to the banking of the fires. What makes the night unusually well documented is that Queen Victoria kept a journal every day of her adult life, in her own hand, in a series of leather-bound volumes that filled most of a bookcase by the time she died, and that in January of this year, of 1868, she did something no reigning monarch in British history had ever done. She published part of it. She published the Highland sections, the years from 1848 to 1861, in a book called Leaves from the Journal of Our Life in the Highlands, dedicated to her dear husband. And the book sold in tens of thousands, and was read in the cottages of her subjects as eagerly as in the drawing rooms of her court. We know what an evening of hers at Balmoral looked like, because she told us. Tonight, we step into a record kept by the woman in the room. Balmoral itself you may already know something about. It sits on the south bank of the River Dee in Aberdeenshire, 50 miles west of Aberdeen, in a country of granite hills and pine forests and heather moor. The estate was purchased by her husband, Prince Albert, in 1852, after they had been renting it for 4 summers and had decided it was the place in all of Britain where they were most themselves. The smaller 15th century building that stood there when they bought it, Albert pulled down, and on a site 100 yards from the old foundations he commissioned a new one of his own design. He drew it up with an Aberdeen architect named William Smith, in the Scots baronial style, of pale grey granite quarried on the estate, with a tower at the southwest corner that rises 80 feet above the entrance and can be seen across the valley from the road that runs west to Braemar. The family moved in during September of 1855. The house is, this autumn, 12 years old, and it is in every detail the work of the husband the woman in the sitting room has not seen in 7 years. The tartan on the carpets is the royal Stuart he chose. The tartan on the curtains is the Balmoral tartan he designed himself, in a grey and red, registered in his name. The portraits, the furniture, the layout of the rooms, the planting of the gardens, the placement of the new bridge over the Dee, all of it is his. To come to Balmoral for her is to come to the most complete monument to him that exists anywhere in the world. And tonight, you are going inside household at Balmoral is not large by the standards of a royal residence. The Queen brings perhaps 30 of her people up from the south with her, the ladies in waiting, the gentlemen in waiting, the private secretary, the equerries, her dresser, her pages, and Balmoral itself has perhaps another 40 staff in the house, the housekeeper, the cooks, the housemaids, the footmen, the gillies, the keepers, the gardeners, the piper. The family present this autumn is small. Princess Louise, the 4th daughter, who is 20 and unmarried still, has been with her mother all summer and has been sketching the views. Princess Beatrice, the youngest of the 9, who is 11 and called baby by the household and the family alike, sleeps in the bedroom next to the Queen's, and is, in everything but the title, her mother's companion. The Prince of Wales, who is 27 and the heir, is not here. He is in Norfolk, hunting, and will come north in October. The other children are scattered across the courts of Europe, Vicky in Berlin as Crown Princess of Prussia, Alice in Darmstadt as Princess of Hesse, Affie at sea as a naval officer, Helena married last year and living in Cumberland, Arthur at Woolwich in his 18th year in his military training, Leopold, the haemophiliac, at 15, and the constant worry of his mother, at Windsor with his tutor. The Queen's letters, written in this evening's sitting room, are her chief connection to these scattered children, and the day's post in and out of Balmoral is the chief artery of the British royal family's domestic life, and in the household, the figure who is the most talked of by the rest of the court, the figure who is part servant and part friend, and part something the English language does not quite have a word for, the figure who has scandalised the political establishment and on whom the Queen has come to depend in a way that has begun to embarrass everyone around her except herself, is John Brown. He is 41. He is the son of a tenant farmer at Crathy, 2 miles down the road. He has been a gillie on the estate since he was a youth, was promoted by Albert to attend the Queen personally when she rode out on the hills, and since Albert's death has become her personal attendant, her gillie, her companion on every walk, her gatekeeper, and the only man in Britain who can speak to her without measuring every word. He is in the kilt always. He is in the corridor outside her sitting room as we begin. You will meet him in a moment. So settle in. The light is going outside the windows of the castle. Lochnagar across the valley has become a dark shape against a sky that is fading from gold to grey to slate. The lamps are being lit by the pages along the corridors. The fires in every public room are being fed. The dressing bell for dinner has not yet rung. The Queen is at her desk in the sitting room. The dogs are at her feet. The household is going about the quiet business of the half hour before dinner. The paper is in the gun room polishing the silver mounts of his pipes for the evening's playing. The kitchens below stairs are at the height of their work. Settle in. The evening is beginning. Let your eyes close. Let your breathing settle. We are going inside. The first thing to know about the inside of Balmoral, as we step into it from the porte cochere at the front of the castle, is that it does not feel like a palace. It feels like the country house of a very rich family who happen to have absolute taste in tartan and an unusual quantity of antlers. The front door opens into an entrance hall perhaps 30 feet by 20, with a stone floor laid in pale flags, a high ceiling of timbered beams, and a tartan carpet running the length of the floor in the Royal Stuart set, the red and green and blue and yellow lines of the most familiar of all the family tartans, the personal property of the sovereign. On the wall to the left, as you come in, hangs a portrait of the Prince Consort by Winterhalter, dating from the late 1850s, in which Albert is shown 3/4 length in the green tweed of a Highland deerstalker, a gun in the crook of his arm, the Aberdeenshire hills behind him, looking as everyone in the family has always said of the portrait, exactly the way they remember him being. On the wall opposite hangs an antler, the great 12-pointer Albert shot at Glenmuick in 1850, mounted on a polished oak plaque with the date carved beneath. The whole hall smells of 3 things at once: the beeswax with which every wooden surface in the castle is polished every Tuesday by a team of housemaids, the peat smoke that comes from the fires in every grate, and the cool slight damp of granite walls that have been holding the Highland weather out of the rooms for 12 years. A page is in the hall as we come in. He is a young man of perhaps 20, in the Royal Stuart kilt that is the livery of the male servants of the household, with a black coat above it, and white stockings below and brogues. He has been in the household since he was 16, 3 years a footman in London, before being brought up to Balmoral last spring, and he takes the cloaks of arrivals with the practised impassivity of a young man who has learned not to be impressed by anyone. He does not look directly at you. He gestures, with a movement of his hand, to the door at the far end of the hall, which leads into the inner corridor of the ground floor. The Queen, he will not say, but everyone in the household knows, is in her sitting room, and visitors are not received there at this hour, because the Queen at this hour is writing her letters, and her letters are not interrupted. We are not, however, visitors. We are guests in a different sense. We are here to spend an evening with her household at the rhythm of its own life, and we are about to walk through to the room where she is. The inner corridor of the ground floor runs the length of the castle east to west. It is wide enough for 2 people to pass without inconvenience, and it is floored in the same tartan carpet as the entrance hall, although here the carpet is wearing a little at the doorways where feet have crossed for 12 years. The walls are wood-panelled to chest-height in pine that has been stained a deep honey colour by the smoke of many fires, and above that the plaster is painted a thick warm cream, almost the colour of butter. Along the corridor at intervals stand the trophies of the estate, the heads of stags shot by Albert, and by the present Prince of Wales, and by the Ghillies, and by the visiting royal cousins, each labelled with the date and the shooter on a small brass plaque, each of them with names: the Mossy Glen Stag of 1855, the Old Six of Glengairn, the Royal of Lochmuick, because the Highland stalking tradition gives names to its great beasts, the way the Royal Navy gives names to its ships. Along the floor, against the panelling, are tables on which sit vases of late-season heather and rowan branches, bright with their orange berries, freshly cut by the head gardener this morning. There is, at intervals, the scent of these flowers added to the older scents of the hall. The corridor is lit, at this hour, by oil lamps with milk-glass shades, which the pages have been going round lighting for the past quarter of an hour, and which are not very bright by modern standards, but which throw a deep, warm light onto the panelling and the tartan and the antlers, and have, as the daylight goes outside, the effect of making the corridor feel like the inside of a beech tree in autumn. Halfway along the corridor on the south side, the side that faces the lawn and Lochnagar beyond, is a door that stands very slightly ajar. The door is panelled pine, painted a deep red with brass fittings. This is the door of the Queen's sitting room. We pause at it. The door is ajar because the dogs are inside the room and the dogs come and go, and because the Queen prefers her doors not closed when she is in residence at Balmoral, because she came up here to feel less imprisoned than she felt at Windsor, and because in the Highlands she has, over the past 16 years, accustomed herself to a way of living that is closer to the way the rest of her subjects live than anything else in her life. We will not push the door open. We will instead slip through the gap and find ourselves inside the room. The sitting room is 24 feet by 18, with a bay window at the south end that gives onto the lawn and the river beyond. The walls are covered with a paper of the Balmoral tartan, the grey and red set that Albert designed in 1853 and registered in his own name, although the paper has been printed on a deep grey ground rather than woven, and the red threads of the design glow faintly in the lamplight. The ceiling is white plaster with a deep cornice, simple, in the way Albert preferred. The floor is polished pine boards laid east to west, with a great hearthrug in the centre of the room of the dressed Stuart tartan, blue and white and green and red. In the bay window at the south end stands the Queen's writing desk, a flat-topped mahogany table with a leather inset on the surface and 3 drawers down each side, set so that her chair faces out of the window and the writer can look up and see the lawn and the river and the mountain. The desk is this evening covered in the orderly disorder of a person who is in the middle of dealing with her post. There are the dispatch boxes from London, 3 of them, in the polished red leather that has been used by the Cabinet Office for 30 years, 2 of them open and 1 still locked. There is an inkstand of cut glass, recently filled. There is a quill in a brass holder. There is a tray of pens. There is a brass paper knife. There are several piles of correspondence, sorted by the lady-in-waiting earlier in the day into the categories with which the Queen prefers to deal with them. There is a leather-bound journal, open its left-hand page covered with the Queen's writing in her sloping, firm hand. There is a photograph in a silver frame, 8 inches by 6, of the Prince Consort, taken in 1860, the year before he died, which sits on the desk, where the Queen can see it at all times, and which she touches when she comes to the desk at the start of any session of work, with the back of her hand as if greeting him. Quaint. The rest of the room is arranged for comfort. Against the long wall facing the bay window stands a chimney-piece of pale stone, simple in design, beneath which a fire of pine logs and peat is burning steadily. The fire has been laid by the housemaid since 5, fed at intervals through the afternoon, and is now at the deep-settled heat that a Highland fire reaches at the end of a Highland day. On the chimney shelf above the fire stand 3 more photographs in silver frames. The Prince Consort again, this time with the Queen beside him, in a photograph from 1854 by Roger Fenton, both of them looking at the camera with a seriousness that does not hide the fact that they are unmistakably happy together. A photograph of the Prince of Wales at his confirmation in 1858, taken by the same Fenton, and a photograph of the Crown Princess Vicky, with her own first son Wilhelm, taken in Berlin in 1859, the child sitting on his mother's lap and looking at the camera with an expression that even at 6 months old has in it something of the man he will become. There are, on either side of the chimney shelf, 2 pieces of silver, a clock that strikes the quarter hours and the half hours and the hours with a deep musical chime, and a small statuette of a Highland gillie holding a stag's head, modelled in silver by a Birmingham silversmith from a drawing the Queen herself made in 1860. Against the east wall stands a harmonium, a portable reed organ in a polished oak case, with 2 stops and a foot bellows, made by Alexander of Paris and brought to Balmoral by Albert in 1857. The Queen plays it occasionally herself, although her playing was always more dutiful than gifted, and Princess Louise plays it well, and the visiting cousins from Germany play it when they are in residence. The harmonium tonight has on its music stand an open volume of Mendelssohn, his Songs Without Words, open to the one called Spring Song which Princess Beatrice has been learning. Beside the harmonium stands a writing table at which Lady Churchill, the lady-in-waiting, sits in the mornings to deal with the household correspondence that does not require the Queen's own hand. Along the west wall are 2 deep armchairs of chintz upholstery, in a pattern of pale pink roses on a cream ground, which look, in this room of tartan and dark wood, almost shockingly feminine. The chairs are set on either side of a low table on which sits a tray of tea things that has not yet been cleared from earlier in the afternoon. The cups are of Colport porcelain in the white with gold rim pattern that has been in family use for 3 generations. There is a teapot, a milk jug, a sugar bowl, a plate with 2 pieces of shortbread on it. On the rug at the Queen's feet, in front of the writing desk, 2 dogs are asleep. The dogs are border collies. The one on the right is the Queen's favourite, a black and white called Sharp, who has been her constant companion for 2 years now, a gift to her from a Mr. Edmonds of London in 1866, who travels with her between Windsor and Balmoral and Osborne, who sleeps at the foot of her bed when his manners are good, and at the door of her room when they are not, and who has a particular way of placing his chin on her foot under the desk when she is writing for any length of time. The second dog, asleep half a yard from Sharp, is a tan and white collie named Noble, younger, the present from John Brown last autumn from a litter on the estate, who is not yet quite settled in the household, but who has, over the past months, accepted that the Queen's foot is a perfectly acceptable place to be near at the end of a long day. The fire burns. The clock on the chimney shelf ticks. The Queen writes. She is, this evening, writing to her eldest daughter Victoria, the Crown Princess of Prussia, who is 28 and lives in Berlin and Potsdam with her husband the Crown Prince Friedrich and their 5 children. Vicky is the most beloved of the Queen's children, in a way that the Queen tries not to admit and never quite manages to disguise, and the letters between London and Berlin run at the rate of 3 or 4 a week in each direction. Vicky writes to her mother about her own household, her children, her German court, the political weather in Prussia, her unhappiness with the rising influence of Bismarck, her loneliness for England, her memory of her father. The Queen writes back at almost the same length and on almost the same subjects with her own observations on the British political weather, her management of her own children, her health, her religion, her dogs, and her view of whatever has happened that day at Windsor or Osborne or, when she is here, at Balmoral. The letters are written in English, in a hand that has not changed substantially since the Queen was 16, and they are sealed with red wax and her private seal of the Queen, and they are sent off by the Daily Messenger to the railway station at Ballater, 7 miles down the valley, where they catch the night mail train south to be on the boat for the continent by the following evening. Tonight's letter, in the moment we are watching her, has reached its 3rd page. The Queen has been at the desk for an hour and a quarter. There are 2 more letters to be written before dinner. She is, this autumn, 49 years and 4 months old. She is short, although the impression people have of her at the time and afterwards is of someone taller than she actually was, because of the carriage and the manner that came with the office. In fact, she stands a fraction under 5 feet. And the narrow chair at the writing desk has been built up at the back with a cushion so that her feet rest properly on the brass footrail. Her hair, which was a dark brown in her youth, is now a streaked brown shot through with grey, drawn back simply under a widow's cap of white lawn, with a long fall of black crape behind. She wears the deep black of the widow's mourning that she has worn since the 14th of December 1861, a dress of black silk with a high neck and long sleeves, and no ornament whatever, except for a single mourning brooch at her throat containing a lock of her husband's hair. Her hands are small and very fine, slightly plump now in middle age, and on the third finger of her left hand she still wears her wedding ring, and Albert's signet ring beside it, the two of them grown into the flesh of the finger, so that they could not be removed if she wanted to remove them. Her face, which has been seen by half of her subjects in one form of reproduction or another, is rounder than the photographs suggest, with a small chin, blue eyes, and a mouth that in repose looks heavier than it does when she speaks. The expression on her face this evening as she writes is a particular one, recognizable to anyone who has spent any time in the room with her at this hour of the day, an absorbed, almost frowning concentration, with her lower lip caught very slightly between her teeth. The pen moves across the page. She writes quickly. She is one of the great letter writers of the 19th century, the producer over her lifetime of an estimated 3,500 pages of journal and perhaps 50,000 letters, and her hand is so accustomed to the work that the pages fill almost without her seeming to think. She is in the lines we are watching her produce, describing to her daughter the walk she took this afternoon up the path along the side of the Dee in the direction of Crethy, with Brown and the two dogs, in which she met the wife of the new minister at Crathy Kirk, and stopped for a quarter of an hour to speak with her. She mentions the woman's name. She mentions the texture of the conversation. She mentions a detail about the woman's bonnet. She writes the way she thinks. The journal at her elbow, open on the desk, has the same scene in it, transcribed half an hour ago, in a slightly fuller form. The letter is the journal rendered for a particular reader. A knock at the door. It is not a tentative knock. It is a firm 3-rap, that is, to everyone in the household who has heard it, recognizable on the first knock as the knock of John Brown. The Queen does not look up. She says, "Come." John Brown comes in. He is 41. He is a tall man, broad in the shoulders, with the kind of weathered face that comes of 40 years spent on the Aberdeenshire hills in all weathers. He has reddish-brown hair, going grey at the temples, a moustache, eyes of a pale blue-grey, and a complexion that is permanently ruddy from the wind. He is in the kilt, as he is always in the kilt. The kilt is of his own personal tartan, which is to say a hunting set of the Stuart, in dark green and blue with thin red lines, with a sporran of badger hair at the front, a kilt pin in the form of a stag's head with a small ruby for the eye and a stroin dub in the right stocking top. Above the kilt he wears a black coat of the cutaway pattern with brass buttons. He has thick wool stockings to the knee in a diced grey and white pattern and brogues with leather laces. He carries in his right hand a small silver tray on which sit a cut glass tumbler containing about 3 fingers of whisky, a small glass jug of water, and a fresh cigar in a silver case, which is not for the Queen, but which he has brought up, because the Queen has asked him to mention to her after he has had his pipe whether the cigar Lord Derby sent her last week, in his judgment fit for visitors, or whether it is the sort of cigar that Lord Derby gave to her in the certainty that she would not know the difference. The Queen had laughed when she had asked him this. Brown had said, with the twitch of one eyebrow that he uses in place of most of his replies, that he would let her know. He sets the tray down on the corner of the desk that is not covered with papers. He says, in his Aberdeenshire accent, which is to a London ear nearly a foreign language, and which the Queen has spent 14 years acclimatizing to, and which she now understands as readily as she understands her own English, "Your whisky, ma'am." The Queen says, "Thank you, Brown." He does not bow, He stands for a moment beside the desk. She is finishing a sentence. She finishes it, lays the pen in its tray, looks up. It is worth pausing in the moment we are watching to look at what is happening between these two people, because it is the most observed and the most argued about feature of the Queen's household at this date. John Brown is the son of a tenant farmer at the Bush Farm 2 miles down the road, who went into service on the estate as a stable lad in 1842, became a gillie under the previous owner, was retained by Prince Albert in 1852, and from about 1858 was the gillie who attended the Queen personally when she rode out into the hills. After Albert's death in December 1861, he became, by a process nobody around her could quite trace, something more than a servant. In 1865 she gave him a formal new title, the Queen's Highland Servant, with a salary of £120 a year and a cottage on the estate, and he was thereafter in attendance on her at Windsor and Osborne, as well as Balmoral. London has not known what to make of this. There have been rumours, there have been jokes in the music halls, there has been a name attached to the Queen in private, Mrs. Brown, which the Queen has heard and has chosen to ignore. The English language has not, in fact, had the vocabulary to describe what Brown is to her. What he is in the form she would acknowledge if pressed, is the only man in her household who speaks to her plainly. He tells her when her plans are foolish. He stands up to her in a way nobody else has stood up to her since Albert. He does not flatter her. He does not manage her. The rest of it is not anyone else's business, and she has held that line for 7 years with the granite immovability of a woman who knows what she is doing and does not care to explain. He stands beside the desk now. He says, "The dogs need their walk yet, Mum." The Queen says, "In half an hour, Brown, after I have finished this letter." Brown says, "The light is going." The Queen says, "Then go without me." He looks at her for a moment. He says, "The dogs will not go without ye." The Queen smiles. She says, "Then they shall wait." He says, "Very good, ma'am," and stands a moment longer, and then turns and goes out of the room and closes the door very precisely behind him. The Queen looks at the door for a heartbeat after it closes. She lifts her cut-glass tumbler. She takes a sip of the whiskey with a measured addition of water. She sets the glass down. She picks up her pen. She returns to the letter. The walk along the Dee, the minister's wife, the bonnet, the autumn berries on the rowans at the kirk gate, the matter in the next paragraph of Vicky's third child, Sigismund, the little prince who died 2 years ago this past June at the age of 21 months from meningitis at Potsdam, whom the Queen had met only once, briefly, when the family visited Osborne in the summer before he was taken. Vicky has not recovered from this loss. The Queen knows it. 2 years on, the letters from Berlin still carry the boy in them, sometimes openly and sometimes only in the silences around the other news. The Queen, who has lost a husband but not yet a child, has been careful in what she writes about Sigismund, because she is one of the few people in Vicky's world who has not stopped saying his name. She writes this evening that she has been thinking of him this week. She does not say why. She does not need to. The boy is in every letter that goes between them, whether either of them mentions him or not. She turns the page. She is at the start of a new sheet of paper. She writes on. The room is silent except for the scratch of her pen, the irregular pop of a knot of pine in the fire, the deep slow tick of the silver clock on the chimney shelf, and the breathing of the 2 dogs at her feet. Outside the bay window, the lawn has gone from green to grey, and the line of Lochnagar against the western sky has become a single dark mass under a band of fading gold. The lamps on the desk have been lit by a footman half an hour ago, and the Queen now writes by the light of 2 oil lamps with green glass shades, the colour of which is on her face a thing only the dogs would notice. She thinks, as she writes, the way most people think when they are doing a familiar task. She is thinking partly about the words she is writing, and partly about 3 or 4 other things at the back of her mind, the way the mind sorts itself when the body has its work in hand. She is thinking about the post that came up from London this morning, and which now lies in the dispatch box on the corner of the desk. The political news is uncertain. Mr. Disraeli, her Prime Minister since February, has held country through the spring and the summer with a steady cleverness she has come to admire, although she did not expect to. She had been doubtful of him at first. He is not Albert's kind of man. He is not anyone's idea of a country gentleman or a Christian statesman. He is a converted Jew, a novelist, an exotic, a flatterer. But he flatters well, and what is more, he treats her, in his letters, as Lord Melbourne used to treat her in her first years on the throne, which is to say, as a woman of intelligence whose opinion is to be sought, and whose feelings are to be respected. She has not forgotten Lord Melbourne. She has not, in nearly 30 years, found a Prime Minister to match him, although Sir Robert Peel was a great man, and Albert had been very fond of him. Mr. Disraeli, in his odd way, comes the nearest. He calls her in his letters fairy, an absurd word for the small dumpy widow she sees in the looking-glass each morning, but a word he uses without irony, and which the Queen, against all the dignity of her office, is beginning to enjoy. The trouble in November will be the general election. The first reformed election under the new Act of last year, which Disraeli himself carried through the Commons against his own party's instincts, and which has nearly doubled the electorate. The verdict of the new electorate is unpredictable, although her advisers tell her that Mr. Gladstone is likely to win. She has not, until recently, much liked Mr. Gladstone. He is a man, she has been heard to say in private, who addresses her as if she were a public meeting. He is also, although she does not yet know it, going to be her Prime Minister for nearly 15 of the next 26 years. Tonight she would prefer not to think about him. She prefers to think about Mr. Disraeli, who has sent her a private note in this week's box which is half political business and half a perfectly judged passage about the gardens at Hughenden. She makes a mental note to reply to him in her own hand tomorrow. She reaches across the desk, in fact, for the note now, because it has been a small pleasure of her afternoon, and because she would like to look at it once more before she returns to the letter to Vicky. The note is on Mr. Disraeli's private paper, in the dark blue ink he uses, in the hand she has come to know by sight. The first half is the political business, the dispatches from India, the matter of the new bishop, the question of the date for the dissolution. The second half is the passage about Hughenden. He describes for her, in the way he can do that no other minister has ever done, the autumn colour coming into the beeches above his house in Buckinghamshire, the swans on the pond, the gardener's report on the dahlias, which were planted in the spring at her own suggestion when she had remarked, in passing in a previous letter, that a country house was the poorer without dahlias. The dahlias, Mr. Disraeli writes, have done splendidly. There are a great many of them. They are arranged in beds laid out in 3 colours after the fashion she had described. The gardener, who is a man named Bradshaw, has named his finest specimen Her Majesty, and would, if Mr. Disraeli might be permitted to ask, request the favour of presenting Her Majesty with a bulb of it for her own gardens. The Queen, reading this passage for the 3rd time tonight, smiles to herself in the lamplight of the desk. She would not have smiled 8 months ago at any communication from any Prime Minister of any persuasion, because she had not in the first 6.5 years of her widowhood seen the use of any of them. She smiles now. Mr. Disraeli has managed something her older children, her ministers of the past several governments, and most of her household have not managed in 7 years, which is to make her, once or twice a week, look forward to opening a piece of post. She lays the note back down on the desk. She returns to the letter to Vicky. She is thinking also about Bertie. Bertie is the Prince of Wales, her eldest son, who is 27 this November, who is married to Alexandra of Denmark, who has 2 small children of his own, and who is, in the Queen's view, the chief sorrow of her widowhood that is not Albert himself. She blames him in a half-acknowledged way that she has never said aloud and has hinted at in writing only once for Albert's death. Albert had gone to Cambridge in late November of 1861 to deal with the news of one of Bertie's earliest indiscretions, had returned from the trip with the chill that became the typhoid that killed him, and the Queen has never, in 7 years, been able to look at Bertie without remembering this. She has tried. She has worked at it. She knows in her better moments that it was not Bertie's fault that his father caught a chill. She knows that the loss of Albert was not the doing of any human creature, but the association has been made in her on the deepest level of her nature, and she cannot shake it. Bertie is in Norfolk this autumn at Sandringham, which she bought him with his marriage settlement, and which he is converting into a sporting estate, and he has not been at Balmoral for 2 years, and the Queen has not asked him to come. The matter sits between them. She would like, in a way she has not let herself say, for it to be otherwise. She does not see how to make it so. She writes, in tonight's letter to Vicky, 3 sentences about Bertie that are entirely cheerful, and that say nothing about any of this, because the Crown Princess of Prussia, devoted as she is to her mother, is also devoted to her elder brother, and the Queen knows that the mention of Bertie in any letter to Berlin must be handled with care. She is thinking also about Leopold. Leopold is her 4th son, who is 15 this April. Leopold is, although the word has not yet been coined in the form it will later take, a haemophiliac. The Queen herself, although she does not know it, is the source of the trait in her family. She has carried it through her own mother's line, and has passed it to her sons in a pattern that will run through the royal houses of Europe for the next 60 years, and will, among other things, contribute in a small but tragic way to the fall of the Russian Empire in 1917. Tonight, Leopold is at Windsor with his tutor, and the Queen has not had a letter from his governor for 4 days, which is 1 day longer than she likes. She has written this afternoon to Mr. Duckworth at Windsor, asking for the daily report to be sent up by telegram if it cannot be sent up by post. The boy is by the Queen's reckoning the most intelligent of all her children, more academic than even Vicky, more like Albert in his mind than any of his siblings. He is also the most physically fragile, the most prone to bleeding from a stumble or a knock, and the one she keeps closest, and the one whose absence from her side at any given hour is most likely to make her uneasy. She is uneasy now. She lays down her pen for a moment. She listens to the silence of the room. She picks up the pen again. Afy is at sea. The Queen's 2nd son, who is 24 and a captain in the Royal Navy, has been on the world cruise of HMS Galatea since January of last year. Gibraltar, the Cape, Australia, New Zealand, and now somewhere in the wide stretch of ocean between New Zealand and the equator. There has been no letter for 3 weeks because the mails from the South Pacific take that long, and there will be no letter in tomorrow's post either. The next one will come on Saturday, in the 2nd post, and the Queen will open it with the held breath that every letter from Afy has produced in her since the March of this year, when an Irish nationalist at a picnic in Sydney had put a bullet into the boy's back at close range, and the Queen had learned of the shooting by telegram 3 days after the fact. The wound had healed. The boy had sailed again in June. The Queen, however, has not unlearned the 3 days she spent in March between the telegram and the news of his recovery, which had been the 3 hardest days of her widowhood that were not the first 3 days. She does not, while she writes, follow this thought far. She reaches for it and lets it go again, the way she has trained herself to handle the worst thoughts that come up around her children. The pen moves on. She is thinking, also, about the daughters. Louise upstairs, 20, unmarried, sketching. The question of who Louise will marry has been the household discussion for 2 years now, and the Queen is, against her own resistance, beginning to come round to the idea that Louise should be permitted to marry a British subject rather than the kind of minor German princeling who has been the destination of her 3 elder sisters. The first British royal marriage to a commoner since 1515, if it happens, would be a thing without precedent in her lifetime. She thinks Louise might marry the Marquess of Lorne, the eldest son of the Duke of Argyll, a man of perfectly suitable birth in Scottish terms, and of perfectly unsuitable rank in English ones. The Queen has not made up her mind. She has not this autumn been able to make up her mind about anything to do with Louise. The daughter who has caused her the least trouble in this regard, although the match itself caused her trouble enough at the time, is Helena. Helena is 22 and was married last summer to Prince Christian of Schleswig-Holstein in a wedding that had divided the family, since Christian had fought on the wrong side of the War of 1864, and his presence in the family was a daily provocation to Vicky in Berlin and to the Princess of Wales, who is Danish. The Queen had wanted the match anyway, because Christian, being a prince without a country, would have to live in England, and Helena would not be lost to Germany the way Vicky and Alice had been. Helena and Christian have a lodge in Windsor Great Park. They will, this April, have their first child. The Queen has had a letter this morning from Helena, reporting that the baby is now moving regularly, and that her health is excellent. The Queen has replied with her own anxieties about confinements and her own counsel, drawn from 9 children, and her own pleasure in the news. She is glad of Helena. She has, in a quiet way she does not always announce, become reliant on Helena, in the way the mother of 9 children comes to be reliant on whichever child has stayed nearest and quietest. She is thinking also about Beatrice. Beatrice is 11 and is upstairs being read to by her governess, and Beatrice is the one daughter who, the Queen has already decided, will not marry at all. The decision has not been communicated to Beatrice. The decision will in fact be modified over the next 2 decades, and Beatrice will in 1885 be permitted to marry Prince Henry of Battenberg on the strict condition that she continues to live with her mother. Tonight, Beatrice does not know that her future has been arranged for her. Tonight, Beatrice is asking her governess what the word melancholy means. The Queen is thinking, also, about the household around her, about Mrs. MacDonald upstairs in her dressing room sorting the evening's gown, about the cook below stairs in the kitchen, who has been working since 6 this morning on the dinner that will be served at 8, about the Ghillies in their cottages along the road, sitting down to their own suppers, about the pages along the corridor lighting the lamps, about the piper of the household, whom she can hear faintly through the closed door, practicing the Sky Boat song in the gun-room, 3 rooms away, about the figure of John Brown, somewhere in the back of the castle, having his own dram of whisky in the steward's room, and waiting for the moment when she will come out of the sitting-room and the evening will properly begin. She thinks of Albert. She thinks of Albert always, in every part of every day, and she has done so for 7 years. The thinking of Albert is not, at this point, a thing she does as a separate activity. It is the under-music of every other thought she has. She thinks of him now, sitting at this desk, because the desk was his choice, and the chair was his order, and the room was his design. She looks up from her writing for a moment, and looks at the photograph of him on the desk corner. He is wearing the green Highland tweed in the photograph, and his hand is on his knee, and he is looking, very steadily, at the camera. The photograph was taken at Balmoral in the summer of 1860, the last summer he was wholly well. She lays the back of her hand against the silver frame for a heartbeat. She returns to the letter. She writes for another 10 minutes. She finishes the letter. She folds the sheets. She seals it with red wax dripped from the candle on the desk, with her private seal pressed firm into the wax. She addresses the outside in her own hand. She places it in the leather post tray at the corner of the desk, for the messenger who will come for the day's outgoing post at 7:30. She picks up the next sheet. She is about to start a letter to her cousin, the Duchess of Cambridge, when the silver clock on the chimney shelf strikes the half hour. It is 6:30. The dressing bell will go in a moment. The dressing bell at Balmoral is a brass handbell carried through the principal corridors of the castle by a footman, who walks at a steady pace from one end of the house to the other, ringing it as he goes. The bell is the signal for the family and the senior household to retire to their rooms to dress for dinner. Dinner at the castle in 1868 is at 8, which is later by half an hour than dinner at Balmoral was in the 1850s, although it remains earlier than dinner at fashionable houses in the south of England, where 8:30 has become the standard. The Queen prefers 8 because it gives her, after the meal, 3 full hours of evening in her own drawing room before bedtime, which she has come to value above almost any other rhythm of her day. She hears the bell, she lays down the pen, she caps the inkwell, she rises from the chair. The dogs at her feet, who have been asleep for the past hour, lift their heads in concert as if a single string had been pulled. Sharp gets to his feet and stretches in the long, luxurious way of a dog who has been waiting all afternoon for this moment. Noble, slower, joins him a beat behind. The Queen crosses to the door, opens it fully, and steps into the corridor with the 2 dogs behind her. In the corridor, the lamps are now all lit. The honey of the panelling has deepened in the lamplight, and the tartans on the floor and on the walls of the corridor's display shelves have taken on the slightly burnished colour that wool acquires under oil light. There is a footman at the end of the corridor by the staircase, in the kilt of the household, who bows as the Queen passes. Brown is not in the corridor. Brown does not, by long-established habit, accompany the Queen on the moves of her ordinary day within the house. He is the figure who attends her out of doors on the walks and the rides and the drives, and the figure who joins her in the evening drawing-room when the family has withdrawn. The transitions within the castle, the moves from one room to another, are managed by the pages and the footmen, and by Mrs. MacDonald, who at the sound of the dressing bell has come down from the upper floors and is now waiting at the foot of the grand staircase. Mrs. MacDonald is the Queen's dresser, and has been for 19 years. She is a Scotswoman from the village of Mar, at the head of the next glen, who came into the household in 1849 as an under-housemaid, was promoted to the Queen's dressing room in 1855, the year the new castle opened, and has been the Queen's personal attendant in matters of clothes, hair, jewels, and small physical care since 1858. She is 52. She has the long, capable face and the iron-grey hair of a Highland woman of her generation. She is in a black silk gown for the evening, with a white linen apron and white linen cap, both starched, both Scotch laundered. She speaks an Aberdeen Scots which she has, over the years, modified for the Queen's ear into a hybrid that is half Scots and half English, and that is impenetrable to the rest of the household. The Queen finds her indispensable. The Queen has, in private, said more than once that MacDonald is the only person in the world who knows the truth about her hair. The 2 women meet at the foot of the stairs. MacDonald says, "Your gown is laid out, ma'am." The Queen says, "Thank you, MacDonald." They go up together. The dogs follow. The grand staircase of Balmoral is wide enough for 3, panelled in light pine, with a balustrade of carved oak in a Celtic interlace pattern that Albert had designed in 1854, and which is the most distinctive single feature of the castle's interior architecture. The staircase rises in a single straight flight from the ground floor to the first floor, with a half landing at the turn at which stands a marble bust of the Prince Consort, on a plinth of porphyry by the sculptor Mary Thornycroft, which the Queen always looks at as she passes. She looks at it now. She places her hand for a heartbeat on the back of the bust's neck as she goes up the second half of the flight. But MacDonald behind her says nothing. The footman at the landing bows. The first floor of Balmoral has at its centre a long corridor running east to west, up which open the principal bedrooms of the family and the lodging rooms of the household. The Queen's apartments are at the eastern end, comprising a sitting room, a bedroom, and a bathroom, with a separate door from her bedroom into the bedroom of Princess Beatrice next door. The carpet of the corridor is the same royal Stuart of the ground floor. The walls are hung with watercolours, mostly by Albert himself and by the Queen and by their elder children, depicting the views of the estate at various seasons and the views of the Highlands beyond it. Some of the watercolours are competent, some of them are extremely competent. The Queen herself was taught watercolour by Edward Lear in the 1840s, and is a more accomplished painter than she allows herself to admit. They reach the dressing room. It is 12 feet by 12 with one window facing east, a fitted mahogany cupboard along one whole wall containing the Queen's evening dresses, a long table at the window on which sits the dressing case of polished mahogany containing the brushes and combs and pins, a tall mirror on a swivel stand, and a low padded stool covered in dress Stuart tartan, on which the Queen sits while MacDonald attends to her hair. The fire in the grate has been lit at 6, and the room is warm enough that the change from gown to gown can be made without the chill that any uncarpeted Highland room takes on at this hour in September. MacDonald removes the Queen's day gown, the heavy black silk she has been wearing since after breakfast, hanging it on the brass hook at the back of the dressing-room door. The Queen stands in her chemise and her drawers and her stays and her white cotton stockings. MacDonald brings the evening gown from the cupboard. It is, like every gown the Queen has worn since the 14th of December 1861, black. It is, however, a black of slightly finer silk than the day gown, with a touch of jet embroidery at the throat and at the cuffs, and a longer train. It is the dress she wears at Balmoral for family dinner, distinct from the heavier and more elaborate black she wears at Windsor when there are courtiers present, and distinct again from the very plainest black she wears in the mornings when she is at her desk. The gradations of her mourning are a private language she has worked out for herself over 7 years, the way some women work out a language of jewels or of hairstyles. MacDonald, who has dressed her in every gradation, requires no instruction. The gown goes on, the hooks at the back are fastened, the lace at the neck is adjusted. MacDonald takes down the Queen's hair, brushes it through with a long-handled silver brush, twists it up into the simple knot at the nape that the Queen has worn since Albert died, and pins it. The widow's cap goes on over the knot, with the fall of black crape behind. The Queen sits looking at herself in the mirror for a moment. She does not look closely. She has, over many years, developed the habit of looking at her reflection without quite focusing on it, in the way that a woman of plain appearance, who has had to look at herself in many mirrors over many years, learns to do. MacDonald takes the cleaned mourning brooch from the box on the table and pins it at the Queen's throat. The brooch contains the lock of Albert's hair. The Queen lays her hand over it for a heartbeat, but MacDonald, behind her at the mirror, says in her Aberdeen Scots that the cook has had the kitchen lass in tears again over the bread. The Queen says, "Has she?" MacDonald says, "Aye, ma'am, for the 4th time this week, and she has had to be spoken to by Mrs. McAllister." The Queen says, "What was the matter with the bread?" MacDonald says, "The matter with the bread was that the bread was the way the cook made it, and not the way the lass made it, and the cook is 61, and has been making the bread the way the cook makes it since before the lass was born, and the lass is 16, and is from a Skye family, and thinks she knows better." The Queen says, "Ah." MacDonald says, "Mrs. McAllister has put the lass to the laundry for a week, which is the worst punishment a kitchen lass can have, and the cook is in good humour again, and the bread tomorrow will be the bread the cook makes it." The Queen says, "The bread tonight was the bread the cook makes it, and the bread tonight was excellent." MacDonald says, "Aye, mum, it was." There is a heartbeat in which the Queen, looking in the mirror at the reflection of her dresser behind her, smiles. She rises. She leaves the dressing room. The dogs are at her heels. Princess Beatrice, whom the household refers to without exception as baby, is in the corridor in her own evening dress, a white muslin with a sash of dress Stuart tartan, her hair done by her nurse, Mrs. Thurston, in the long ringlets that the Queen prefers her to wear, and the child takes her mother's hand as the small procession moves along the corridor. Princess Louise, who has been in her own room finishing her sketch of the view from the window, emerges from the door across the way in a gown of the same black as her mother's, but cut more youthfully, with white lace at the wrists, and joins them. Lady Churchill, who has been in her room reading, comes out of her door at the end of the corridor in a dark grey silk that is not technically mourning, but is the colour she has worn in attendance on the Queen for 7 years out of consideration. The 4 women, in their soft cluster, move down the staircase together, the dogs ahead, the Queen on Beatrice's hand, Louise on her mother's left, Lady Churchill a half-step behind. At the foot of the staircase the gentlemen are waiting. General Charles Grey, the Queen's private secretary, 64, a soldier in his youth and a courtier since his middle age, who has been her secretary for the past year and a half, and whose health, although she does not yet know it, will fail in the spring. He is in evening dress with the riband of the Bath. Sir Thomas Biddulph, keeper of the Privy Purse, beside him, in evening dress also. Lord Charles Fitzroy, the equerry in waiting this autumn, a younger man, in the kilt of the household by privilege. A clergyman, the Reverend Dr. Robertson of Crathy, who has been invited to dine, in his black gown. The Queen greets them in turn, with the brief inclination of the head that is the household evening signal. Dr. Robertson bows. The Queen says, "Good evening, Dr. Robertson. We are very glad to have you." He bows again. The little procession moves through the door into the dining room. The dining room at Balmoral is 40 feet long by 20 wide, in the south wing of the ground floor, with 3 windows looking onto the south lawn. The floor is polished pine. The walls are wood-panelled in pine that has been stained the same honey colour as the corridor outside. The ceiling is plaster, with a deep cornice. At intervals along the panelling hang Highland landscapes in oil, 2 by Landseer, 1 a stalking scene of the old 6 of Glencairn with the Ghillies in the foreground, the other a study of 2 stags fighting in a clearing, which Albert bought from the artist in 1850, and which the Queen has come to regard as the centrepiece of the room. The table in the centre of the room is a long mahogany table, 26 feet, set tonight for 12. The chairs are mahogany also, with seats covered in the royal Stuart. The table is laid in the family pattern with the white and gold coalport, the silver from the strong room downstairs, 4 cut glass decanters of claret, 2 of Madeira, 2 of port, an arrangement of late roses and rowan berries down the centre, and tall white candles in silver candlesticks at intervals. The candles this evening are the only light in the room, with the curtains drawn against the dusk, and the room glows in the way that any panelled dining room of the period glowed when 12 white candles were lit on a polished table. The household sits. The Queen takes her place at the head of the table, with General Grey on her right and Dr. Robertson on her left. Princess Louise is across from Beatrice. Sir Thomas Biddulph is at the foot. Lady Churchill is next to Dr. Robertson by long arrangement, since the Queen has noticed that Lady Churchill talks easily to clergymen, and that clergymen often need a hand in the talk. The footman in the kilt of the household and the white cotton gloves of the table, stand against the wall behind the chairs in the positions assigned to them. The butler, MacGregor, is at the side table behind the Queen. He inclines his head. He signals to the first footman. The first course goes round. The first course is a soup of Scotch broth, made by the cook from the lamb bones of yesterday's joint, with barley and leeks and a touch of the dripping. It is served in white porcelain bowls, with a plate on which sits a triangle of brown bread. The Queen eats her soup quickly. The Queen is, as the household has known for 30 years, and the rest of the court has come to know with varying degrees of distress, a fast eater who reaches the end of each course before most of the other diners have begun the middle of theirs, and whose finished plate is the signal that the course is over by an iron rule of court etiquette, regardless of where the rest of the table is. Tonight, in the privacy of Balmoral, the rule is observed gently rather than rigidly. The footmen do not whisk the plates away until everyone has been allowed to make a fair attempt. But the Queen is finished long before anyone else, and she is sitting back in her chair with her napkin folded in her lap before half the table has eaten half its soup. Dr. Robertson, who is not a regular guest and who is concentrating on not being clumsy, has managed 3 spoonfuls. The second course goes round. It is the salmon from the Dee, which one of the Ghillies brought up from the river at 3 this afternoon. 6.5 pounds on the scale, scaled and cleaned and poached whole in a court bouillon by the cook between 4 and 7, served in a long silver fish server with a hollandaise sauce in a separate boat. The footmen carry the dish round the table, presenting it to each diner who serves himself or herself with the slice that goes onto the plate. The Queen takes a smallish portion. Dr. Robertson, encouraged by Lady Churchill, takes a generous one. The Queen mentions, in a courteous aside to Dr. Robertson, that the salmon was caught at the pool above the Iron Bridge by Sandy Stewart this afternoon, and Dr. Robertson, who knows the pool above the Iron Bridge from a fishing holiday of his own in 1862, asks her if the river is at a fishable height this autumn, and the Queen, who has been on the riverbank twice this week with Brown and who knows the height of the water to the inch, gives him a perfectly serious and detailed answer. The third course is the grouse. The grouse came off the moor on the 12th of August in the great party of the year, the opening day, when 15 guns shot over the western beats and brought down 980 birds in a single day, and the birds have been kept hung in the larder at Balmoral and at Windsor for various lengths of time appropriate to the maturing of grouse. And tonight's birds are 6 weeks hung and at the height of their flavour. They are roasted whole and served on a slice of fried bread with a bread sauce and a red currant jelly and game chips. The Queen, who is fond of grouse beyond almost any other meat, eats hers with concentration. The conversation around the table runs in its proper Victorian rhythm, the men talking quietly to the women on their left and right, the higher conversation at the upper end of the table, running on the river and the moor and the post from London, the lower conversation between Beatrice and Princess Louise running on the painting. Louise has been working on this afternoon and on the new pony. Beatrice has been promised for her birthday in the spring. The dishes go round in their order. The savoury, a dish of cheese ramekins. The pudding, an apple charlotte, made with the apples from the kitchen garden, and a custard. The dessert, fruit and nuts and a glass of Madeira. The whole dinner has taken 55 minutes. The Queen rises. The ladies rise with her. The gentlemen rise. The Queen leads Beatrice and Louise and Lady Churchill out of the dining room and back along the corridor to the drawing room, leaving the gentlemen to a quarter of an hour of port at the end of the table before they will come through. The drawing room at Balmoral is on the southeast corner of the ground floor, the largest of the principal rooms, 36 feet by 24, with windows on 2 sides. The east windows look onto the gravel drive and beyond it to the rising pine slope of Craiggowan. The south windows look across the lawn to the Dee and the dark mass of Lochnagar beyond. The room is at this hour entirely shuttered, the heavy curtains of Balmoral tartan drawn across, and the only light is the firelight from the great open hearth on the inner wall and the half-dozen oil lamps which the pages have lit before dinner. The wallpaper is a dark green, the colour of which is at this hour a very warm green, almost the colour of moss. The carpet is the dress Stuart, the blue and white and green and red of Albert's chosen set, deeper at the centre of the room where the table is, and worn a little at the edges where the chairs have stood for 12 years. The room is furnished comfortably rather than grandly. 2 large sofas face each other across the hearth, both upholstered in the same chintz of pink roses on cream that the Queen has on the chairs in her downstairs sitting room. 6 armchairs of various periods and patterns are arranged in the room in pairs and threes, with the tables beside each one for the placing of a book or a cup or a piece of needlework. A round table in the centre of the room is covered tonight with a green baize cloth, and on it are laid out the photograph albums that the household keeps at Balmoral, 4 of them, in red Morocco leather with the royal cipher gilded on the spine, containing the photographs of family and friends and visitors that the Queen has collected with her own hand over the past 15 years. A grand piano in pale rosewood stands against the south wall, between the 2 south windows. The lid is up. The music stand has on it a sheaf of Schubert songs that Princess Louise was practicing this morning. 2 larger pieces of furniture, a long cabinet against the east wall containing the family's collection of antique china, a deep mahogany bookcase against the inner wall by the fire, in which are kept the books most often wanted by the family on these evenings: Tennyson, Scott, Burns, Mrs. Oliphant's novels, the Highland sketches of Edwin Landseer, the family Bible. The ladies come in. The Queen takes her chair on the right of the hearth, the one that is hers by long use, with its footstool. Lady Churchill takes the armchair across from her. Louise crosses to the piano and lifts the lid and runs her finger absently down the keys before she sits. Beatrice settles on the rug at her mother's feet with her book. It is The Water Babies by Mr. Kingsley, the gift to her from Princess Vicky last Christmas, of which Beatrice has read most of the better passages 4 or 5 times and is now reading again. The dogs come in last of all and lay themselves down on either side of the hearthrug. The fire is fed by a footman with 2 fresh pine logs and a couple of pieces of peat from the basket. The peat catches at once. The thin, sweet smoke of it rises into the chimney. The room settles. For 5 minutes after the entrance of the ladies, the conversation is the ordinary flow of comment that follows any dinner. Lady Churchill mentions that the salmon was excellent. The Queen agrees. The Queen says that she hopes Dr. Robertson was at his ease, and Lady Churchill assures her that he was, although it always takes Dr. Robertson a glass of port before he stops being terrified by being at the Queen's table. The Queen smiles. Beatrice from the rug says, "Mamma, what is melancholy?" The Queen looks at her. The Queen says, "Why do you ask, baby?" Beatrice says, "I asked Miss Hildyard this afternoon, and she gave me a long answer that I did not understand." The Queen says, "Melancholy is a sadness that lasts a long time. It is the sadness that does not go off the way. Ordinary sadness goes off. It is a thing that some people have because they are made that way, and some people have because of something that has happened to them, and some people have without quite knowing why." Beatrice says, "Did Papa have it?" The Queen, who has been struck briefly into silence by the question, says, "No, baby, your Papa was the cheerfulest man I have ever known." Beatrice says, "Do you?" The Queen says, "Only when I have not been at Balmoral long enough." There is a pause. Beatrice says, "Then we must keep you here." The Queen says, "Yes, baby, we must." Louise at the piano begins to play. She plays well. She is the daughter who has inherited the most of her father's musical taste, although none of her father's playing ability, and she has a particular feeling for the Schubert songs that Albert loved and used to play himself in this room before he was ill. She plays the Schubert Stanchen, the serenade, without singing. The room listens. The fire burns. Beatrice, who has heard her sister play this piece many times, lays her head against her mother's knee. The Queen, who hears it in this room and remembers Albert at the same piano playing the same piece in the autumn of 1860, places her hand on Beatrice's hair and leaves it there. The piece comes to its end. Louise turns from the piano. She says, "Mama, may I play the German one?" The Queen says, "Yes, my dear." Louise plays the Mendelssohn Lied ohne Wort in, the one called Consolation. It is the piece Albert played in this room on the last evening they were at Balmoral together, in October of 1861, 2 months before he died. Louise knows this. The Queen knows that Louise knows this. Louise is 20, and is not yet at the age at which a daughter knows for certain what to do about her widowed mother's grief. Her mother, who is 49, and has been the world's most public widow for 7 years, is grateful for the playing and would not interfere with it for anything. The piece runs its short course. The room listens. The dogs sleep. The fire moves. The gentlemen come in. They have had their 15 minutes of port. The clergyman is, as Lady Churchill predicted, a little easier in his shoulders. General Grey takes the second armchair beside Lady Churchill. Sir Thomas Biddulph takes the chair on the Queen's left. Dr. Robertson takes the chair opposite the Queen, on the other side of the hearth from her, which is the chair into which guests of honour are placed for the evening conversation at Balmoral. The equerry Lord Charles Fitzroy takes the chair beside Louise at the piano and engages her in a low conversation about the piece she has just played, in which it is clear within 2 minutes that Lord Charles knows nothing whatever about music and is in love with the princess. The Queen, who has been watching the development of this with the unblinking maternal attention she gives to any motion involving her daughters, makes a mental note. She has views on Lord Charles Fitzroy. Dr. Robertson is asked by the Queen about Crathy Kirk. He answers carefully. The attendance has been good through the summer. The harvest Thanksgiving last Sunday was full. The new wing of the manse is finished and his wife is grateful. The school in the village has 32 children on its roll this term, 4 more than last year. The Queen, who is a Presbyterian when she is in Scotland in a way that she is not at Windsor, takes a real interest in the welfare of Crathy Kirk and asks specific questions about specific families in the village, every one of whom is known to her by name. Dr. Robertson, who knows that he is being tested in a benign way by the Queen's encyclopedic knowledge of his own parish, answers each question. The Queen is satisfied. She tells him that she will be in the kirk on Sunday morning. He bows his head. General Grey turns the conversation, in the careful way of a private secretary, to the news from the south. The dispatch box that came up by the night mail this morning has been read in part by the Queen and in part by Grey himself, and there are matters in it that bear discussing in this informal way before the formal audience tomorrow morning. The election. The Reform Act of last year has nearly doubled the British electorate, from 1.5 million voters to 2.5, and the first general election under the new franchise will be held next month, beginning in mid-November. The Conservative government of Mr. Disraeli, which has held office since February, when Lord Derby resigned through illness, is expected by most observers to lose, although Disraeli himself has been writing to the Queen in tones of careful optimism. Mr. Gladstone, a Liberal leader, is campaigning on the disestablishment of the Irish Church, which has been the dominant political question of the year, and which the Queen, in her own private view, opposes, but is too constitutionally careful to oppose openly. The Irish Church question is, in essence, The question of whether the Church of England, as established in Ireland, the body which has been the official state church of the country since the 16th century, should be disestablished, separated from the state, deprived of its tithes, reduced to the position of a voluntary body, given that the great majority of Irish people are Roman Catholic, and that the established church serves only the Protestant minority of perhaps 1 in 8. Gladstone, who is in religious terms a high churchman, and in political terms a man of intense moral conviction, has come to the position that the Irish establishment is an injustice that cannot stand. He has carried his party with him. He is going, in the election that begins next month, to make the disestablishment the central plank of his platform. He will win. He will, the following year, carry the Irish Church Act through Parliament, and the Church of Ireland will be disestablished from the 1st of January 1871. The Queen, who in her best moments has the sense to see that Gladstone is right on the merits of the case, will accept the Act with the constitutional reluctance she always brings to anything Gladstone proposes. Tonight in the drawing room of Balmoral, she has not yet been asked to do anything about any of this, and the conversation about it is the comfortable speculative conversation of a household in which the most pressing political question of the season is something happening 500 miles away. The conversation turns from Ireland to India. Lord Charles Fitzroy, who was for 2 years on the staff of the Viceroy at Calcutta and who has views, mentions the recent disturbances in Bengal and the question of the new Viceroy. Sir John Lawrence is in his last year. He will be succeeded next January by Lord Mayo, although Mayo's appointment has not been formally announced yet. The Queen, who has taken her status as Empress of India seriously since the proclamation of 1858, asks several questions about the state of feeling in the country 10 years after the mutiny. Lord Charles answers as well as he can. The Queen says, almost as much to herself as to the rest of the room, that we cannot afford another mutiny in our lifetime. The room is silent for a heartbeat. General Grey changes the subject smoothly to the Abyssinian medals, which were struck this summer and which were sent up to Balmoral last week for the Queen's inspection, and which she has now approved for issue to the men who served under Napier in the storming of Magdala in April. The room moves on. The Abyssinian expedition is, this autumn, the great recent military achievement of the British Army. Earlier in the year, an army of some 13,000 men under the command of Sir Robert Napier had marched 400 miles inland from the Red Sea coast through the highlands of Abyssinia to the mountain fortress of Magdala held by the Emperor Theodore, who had been holding a number of British and European hostages, including the British consul Mr. Cameron. The march had been a feat of military engineering carried out under impossible conditions of climate, supply, and terrain. The fortress had fallen in April. The hostages had been released. The Emperor had killed himself before he could be captured. The army had marched back out again, with all its men and most of its equipment, and had embarked at the coast in June. The whole campaign had cost some £9 million and had not lost more than half a dozen men to battle, although disease had taken more, and it had been hailed in the British press as the model of how a Victorian punitive expedition ought to be conducted. The Queen has been intensely proud of it. She has corresponded with Napier through the summer. She approved his peerage as Lord Napier, Magdala in July. The medals she has now approved will go out to the men over the next 12 months. General Grey, having brought the conversation to the medals, allows it to pass naturally to the question of the army reform that Mr. Cardwell will bring forward when the next Parliament sits. The Queen listens. She does not, on the whole, like the proposals, that abolition of purchase of commissions is something Albert had recommended in his time, and she therefore cannot oppose it in principle, but the abolition of flogging in peacetime and the shortening of soldiers' enlistments are matters on which she has reservations. She lets the conversation flow without pressing her own view. She has trained herself over the past several years to listen more than she once did. It was Albert's habit. She tries to keep it as a way of remembering him. Lord Charles Fitzroy, who has himself been through the academy at Woolwich, and who has remembered halfway through the army reform conversation that the Queen will be interested in this, mentions that he had a letter this week from a friend at Woolwich containing a passage about Prince Arthur, who is in his second year of the senior course, and who is, by the friend's account, doing very well in mathematics and very well in the field exercises, and is reckoned by the cadet body the steadiest boy in his year. The Queen looks up. The Queen says, "That is good news, Lord Charles, and thank you for mentioning it." Lord Charles bows his head. The Queen does not say more, but her face for the moment of the exchange has the look that her face has only ever had on the subject of her third son, who was born on the 1st of May 1850 in the year of the Duke of Wellington's stewardship of the army, and who was taken at his christening into the Duke's old hands, and who has been, in the 18 years since, the easiest of all her children. Arthur is at Woolwich tonight, asleep in the senior dormitory in a narrow iron bed with his uniform laid out for the morning's reveille at 5. He will, next summer, be commissioned into the Royal Engineers. He will live, although the Queen does not know it and would be astonished to be told, until 1942, the last surviving child of his mother and the only one of her children to outlive 2 world wars. None of this is known yet. The Queen, in the drawing-room, registers Lord Charles's piece of news with the private satisfaction she allows herself only about Arthur. She returns to the wider conversation. At about 9:15, the conversation is interrupted by the door of the drawing-room opening and the household piper coming in. The piper is William Ross, who has been the Queen's personal piper since 1854, a Highlander from Inverness-shire, who is now in his early 40s and is the only piper in Britain at this date who holds his appointment by royal warrant in his own name. He is in the full dress of the royal steward, kilt and plaid and feather bonnet, his pipes carried under his left arm. He bows to the Queen at the door. She inclines her head. He turns and walks back out into the corridor. What is the great daily musical event of the household? The piper at Balmoral, by an arrangement laid down by Albert in 1854 and observed without alteration ever since, plays a pibroch outside the door of the drawing-room each evening between the dinner and the bedtime. He plays in the corridor, with the door of the drawing-room left open by the page, and the music comes into the room through the open doorway and fills the room with the great deep voice of the pipes, the drone and the chanter, in the way that only the pipes played indoors in a stone-walled corridor can fill a room. He plays for 10 minutes. He plays sometimes a slow air and sometimes a march, depending on the Queen's mood and on the season. Tonight he plays the Skyboat song, slow, in a setting Ross himself has written for the pipes, in which the chanter carries the melody, and the drone holds beneath it the deep, long note of the sea-water under the keel of the boat carrying the prince away. The room is silent for the 10 minutes. The dogs lie still. The Queen, her hand on Beatrice's hair, looks into the fire. Princess Louise looks at her mother. Lady Churchill looks at the carpet. Dr. Robertson, who has not heard the household pipes before, has tears on his cheeks by the 3rd verse. He does not wipe them. The piper finishes. He plays the last long note. He lets it die. He bows in the corridor outside the open door. He moves on along the corridor, playing a quieter air now, which will carry through the house to the upper floors and to the servants' hall, and which will end at the door of the housekeeper's room, where he will be received with a dram of whisky. The Queen looks up. She says, "That was beautifully done." There is a murmur of agreement in the room. Dr. Robertson takes out his handkerchief at last and uses it briefly. Princess Louise, who has heard the household piper play every evening of her life that she has been at Balmoral, says quietly, "Mama, the Sky Boat Song." The Queen says, "I asked for it." There is a pause. Then the room moves on. The conversation, after the piper, settles into the lower-pitched register that the room takes on after music. Lady Churchill has picked up her needlework, a piece of canvas work in a Berlin wool pattern of pansies and forget-me-nots that she has been working on for nearly a year, and which is destined to be the cover of a footstool in the Queen's sitting room at Osborne. Princess Louise has come away from the piano and has taken the chair beside Lord Charles Fitzroy, and the two of them are in a conversation about the new ferns that Louise has been collecting from the woods this autumn. Beatrice has gone back to the water babies. General Grey has produced a leather notebook and is making a note about something the Queen said earlier in the evening. Sir Thomas Biddulph and Dr. Robertson are discussing, in the manner of two men who have just met and are establishing common ground, the price of black-faced sheep in the Western markets this year. The fire burns. The clock on the chimney-piece, a slightly more ornate clock than the one in the Queen's downstairs sitting room, in marble and gilt bronze, ticks the half-hour. The door of the drawing-room opens. It is John Brown. He has come in to take the dogs out for their last walk before bed. The walk is the closing piece of the dogs' day, in which they go down the steps from the front door, round the gravel drive once, and then off across a short stretch of the lawn to a particular bush which serves their purposes, before being brought back to the porch and let in by the page. The walk takes 12 minutes. It has been Brown's task every evening when the Queen is in residence, for the past 6 years. He is in the same kilt and the same coat as before dinner. He has had his own supper in the steward's room, with a glass of whisky, and he is now refreshed and very slightly pinker in the face than he was at 6. He bows in the doorway. He says, "The dogs, Sharp at the Queen's feet is already on his feet. Noble is sitting up." The Queen says, "Yes, Brown," and reaches down and rubs Sharp behind the ear with the same fond automatic motion she has made every evening for 2 years. Brown crosses the room with the unhurried, confident step of a Highlander, who is entirely at home in a royal drawing-room and has been so for 13 years, and has long since ceased to find it remarkable. He pauses at the Queen's chair. He says, in a voice meant only for her, "The cigar from his lordship is no, a cigar I would smoke in company." The Queen, looking up, says no. He says, "No, ma'am." He says, "It would do very well for the keepers of an evening if you were minded to be rid of it." The Queen, who has not laughed openly at Brown in this room in front of Dr. Robertson before, considers for a heartbeat whether to laugh now, and then does briefly behind her hand. She says, "Then by all means give it to them, Brown, and tell them it is from Lord Derby with my compliments." Brown says, "Very good, ma'am," with the twitch of the eyebrow that is the most expression he has given the whole exchange. He moves on past her chair, the dogs already on their feet and at his heel, and ready for the door. He says good evening to the room as he passes through it, with the brief inclination of the head that is the only formality he ever offers. Lord Charles Fitzroy nods to him. Dr. Robertson, who has not previously met him and has been wondering whether he would, looks at him with frank curiosity. The Queen says, "Brown, this is Dr. Robertson of Crathy," and Brown turns his head and says, "I ken Dr. Robertson, ma'am. Well, my mother went to him for the room last March." And Dr. Robertson says, "Yes, indeed, Mr. Brown, I remember the consultation." There is a moment in which the room, looking on, sees the piece of social geometry by which a Highland gillie and a Crathy minister and the Queen of England are all known to each other and all situated in the same village world. The geometry has been in place since the Queen first came to Balmoral. It is one of the things she likes about being here. Brown crosses to the door with the 2 dogs at his heel. He says, "Ma'am, the night is settling. Will I bring them back through?" The Queen says, "Yes, Brown, bring them back through." He says, "Very good, ma'am," and goes out, and the door draws to behind him. In the lull that follows, Princess Louise says, "Mama, may I show Dr. Robertson the photograph albums?" The Queen says, "By all means, my dear." Louise rises and crosses to the round table and opens the first of the Morocco-bound albums. Dr. Robertson rises and goes over. Sir Thomas Biddulph rises with him. The three of them stand at the table, and Louise turns the heavy gilded pages. The albums contain the photographs the Queen has had taken of her household and her family over the past 15 years. There is the Crown Princess and the Crown Prince of Prussia on the steps at Osborne in 1859. There is the Prince Consort in his Highland dress. It's the same image as the portrait in the entrance hall, but a smaller photographic version. There is the 4-year-old Prince Leopold sitting on a pony at the door of the new castle in 1857. There is the Princess Royal and her infant son Wilhelm in Berlin in 1859. There is Mrs. MacDonald, taken in 1860 in her own dressing room, in a photograph in which she appears to be glaring at the camera with the patient indignation of a Scottish servant who has been told that this would only take a moment and that the photographer would be quick about it. Louise turns the pages. Dr. Robertson, who is genuinely interested in photography and who has himself dabbled in the wet plate process, asks questions about the conditions of the exposures. Sir Thomas Biddulph contributes the answer in one case and the wrong answer in another. The Queen, watching this from her chair, thinks about how strange it is that she has in her drawing room the visual record of her family in a degree that no monarch before her has ever had. Photography, which she has lived with since it was invented, is a thing she has embraced from the start. She and Albert were photographed together in 1854 by Roger Fenton. The royal children were photographed throughout the 1850s. The Queen has a complete photographic record of her family at every year of their lives, from her eldest daughter's wedding in 1858 to her own widowhood. She is, in this regard as in several others, the first modern monarch. She thinks, watching the album turn under her daughter's hand, of how Albert had loved the photographs. He had been the first member of any royal family in the world to be photographed in plate form for personal portraiture in 1842, when he was 22, and the process was an experiment. He had collected the work of the best photographers of the 1850s. He had encouraged the new art at every turn. She thinks of the photograph of him she keeps on her desk downstairs. She thinks of the photograph of him by mail taken in 1860, which is in the album Louise is now turning. She thinks of the photograph of him in his coffin, which is in another album, in a locked cabinet upstairs, which only she and MacDonald have ever seen. The fire moves, a peat falls. The room continues, the door opens again, and Brown is back with the two dogs, who have completed their walk and are now wet around the paws from the lawn grass, and are anxious to return to their position on the rug at the Queen's feet. They cross the room directly. They lie down. Brown stands for a moment by the Queen's chair. He says, in a low voice meant only for her, "The wind is getting up, ma'am. There will be a rain by midnight." The Queen says, "Then we shall hear it on the roof." He says, "Ye will, ma'am." He goes out, and the latch clicks shut behind him. The room settles back to its conversation. Lady Churchill says, mentioning it as a thing she has been thinking of all afternoon, that her sister wrote from London this week that the bookshops are still selling the Highland Journal at a steady rate, although the great rush of the spring is over. The Queen looks up. The Highland Journal is the book she published in January, Leaves from the Journal of Our Life in the Highlands, edited from her own diaries of the years 1848 to 1861, dedicated to the memory of the Prince Consort, printed in a first edition of 20,000 copies which sold out in a week, reprinted twice in February and again in April, and which has by this autumn sold something in the order of 100,000 copies in Britain and a further 50,000 in the colonies and in the United States, where it has been pirated by 3 separate New York publishers. The book is the most successful work of original prose by a member of the royal family that has ever appeared. It is also, by the standard of any earlier monarch's surviving writings, an almost incomprehensibly intimate document. The Queen describes in it her happiness with Albert. She describes her children. She describes her servants by name. She describes her conversations with John Brown. She describes the smell of the heather and the colour of the rowans in autumn, and the particular way the light falls on the lawn at Balmoral in the late afternoon. The book has been read by tens of thousands of her subjects who have never been within 500 miles of Balmoral and who have, in reading it, formed an idea of the Queen of England as a real woman with a real grief and a real love of a real country, in a way that no political dispatch and no painted portrait and no public proclamation could have produced. It has, in the months since its publication, changed her relationship with her people in a way that even she has not fully grasped. She says after a moment, "I had not expected it to do so well." Sir Thomas Biddulph says, "Ma'am, you have not had a letter on the matter for a fortnight that has not said you had not expected it to do so well." The Queen says, "That is because I had not expected it to do so well." There is a laugh round the room. Sir Thomas, who is more familiar with the Queen than anyone except General Grey, has the privilege of private jokes. The Queen says, "But I am very gratified by it, of course, and I have had this week 2 more letters from country clergymen asking permission to read from it in their sermons, and one from a school in Yorkshire asking whether the chapter about Princess Beatrice's pony might be set as a piece of dictation for the senior girls. I have, of course, refused both, although I am sure my husband would have laughed at the school in Yorkshire." Princess Louise says, "Papa would have liked the school in Yorkshire. He would have liked it that the children might learn to write from a description of a pony." The Queen looks at her daughter. The Queen says, "Yes, my dear, he would have liked that." There is a pause. Dr. Robertson, who has been waiting all evening for the opening to mention this, says quietly, "Ma'am, your book has been read in this parish too. I have, myself, copies of it that I have lent to several of my parishioners, and I have it on my own desk in the manse." The Queen says, "Thank you, Dr. Robertson." She does not say more. She does not need to. The Highland Journal, in its way, is a book about Crathy, as much as it is about anything else. The village is named in it. The kirk is named in it. The men of the estate are named in it, and the families of those men have read the references to themselves in the book with the kind of complicated pride that comes of finding one's name in print in a book by the Queen of England. To date. General Grey, in the lull that follows, says, "Ma'am, Mr. Disraeli mentioned in his private note this week that he had read the book a 3rd time, and that he had found a fresh felicity in it on every reading." The Queen smiles. The Queen says, "Mr. Disraeli is a flatterer." General Grey says, "Indeed, ma'am, but he is a remarkably good one." The Queen says, the clock strikes 10. The room shifts. Beatrice has fallen asleep against her mother's knee with the water babies open at the page describing the river. Her nurse has been waiting in the corridor since 9:30, and now puts her head round the door. The Queen lifts Beatrice gently with one hand under each arm and stands her on her feet. Beatrice is in the half-asleep state of an 11-year-old who has just been woken and is not quite sure where she is. Her mother says, "My baby, kiss me good night," and Beatrice does on the cheek with the absent kiss of a child going up. The Queen says, "Sleep well, baby." Beatrice says, "Mama," and is taken away through the door by her nurse, and the door closes. Princess Louise rises a moment later. She says, "Mama, I shall go up." The Queen says, "Very well, my dear, sleep well." Louise crosses to her mother and kisses her on the cheek and says quietly, "Mama, the music was for him." The Queen says, "My dear, I know." Louise straightens and curtsies briefly to the rest of the room and is gone. Lady Churchill stays. The gentlemen stay. Dr. Robertson, after another quarter of an hour of conversation about the parish and the river, makes his goodbye. He is sent off with the use of the open carriage to take him the half-mile down the road to the manse. The Queen thanks him for his company. He bows. He goes out. The remaining four, the Queen, Lady Churchill, General Grey, and Sir Thomas Biddulph, sit in the smaller circle that the room takes on after the family have gone up and a guest has been seen off. This is the half hour of the Queen's evening in which the household has her closest attention, and in which the working business of the day, which has been hovering at the edges of the evening since dinner, is sometimes spoken about properly. General Grey draws his chair a fraction closer. He says, "Ma'am, the box for tomorrow's audience contains the dispatches from Lord Mayo's appointment, and the new figures from the Education Office, and a private letter from Mr. Gladstone, which I have not yet opened because it is marked for your hand only." The Queen says, "Then I shall open it tomorrow, Grey, and you will dislike whatever is in it." General Grey says, "Very probably, there is a brief conversation about the matters of the next day, a walk in the morning, an audience with the steward at 11, a long letter to be answered to the Duke of Cambridge, the matter of the new sub-deacon at the chapel at Crathy, the decision about whether to ride or to drive to the cottage at Glenmuick on Friday." The Queen's mind, which has been kept warm by the music and the conversation, makes the ordinary decisions of the next day with the readiness of a woman who has decided 10,000 such matters in this room over the past 12 years. The fire has burned down to its deep-settled bed. The clock on the chimney shelf shows 10:15. The Queen looks at it. She says, "Well," the household, by the long-developed language of these evenings, knows what well means. The evening is closing. General Grey, Sir Thomas Biddulph, and Lady Churchill rise. They make their brief bows and their good night. The Queen takes Lady Churchill's hand for a heartbeat and says, "Sleep well, Jane." Lady Churchill has been her closest friend in the household for 19 years, since 1854, when she came in as a lady of the bedchamber at 28. The two of them have been a sisterhood through the births and the marriages and the dying, and the Lady Churchill at 52, who has been beside the Queen tonight, is the same Lady Churchill who held the Queen's hand through the night of the 14th of December, 1861. The two of them do not have to say much to each other at the end of an evening. They never have. Lady Churchill returns the pressure of the hand. She goes out. The Queen is left in the drawing-room with the dogs and the firelight. She does not rise at once. She sits in her chair a moment and looks at the fire. The fire is now mostly embers, with one or two faint flames running over a stick of birch that has not quite caught. The room is quieter than it has been all evening, although the silence is not absolute. The wind that Brown predicted has begun to come up against the south windows, and the curtains stir very slightly with each gust, and there is far above the distant sound of the rain Brown said would come. The Queen rises. The dogs rise with her. She crosses to the door. The page in the corridor opens it for her. She passes through. She walks back along the corridor by the now lower light of the lamps that have been burning all evening, and that have begun to dim as their wicks run down towards the morning. She reaches the foot of the staircase. The footman bows. The Queen begins to climb. She climbs slowly. The two dogs are with her, Sharp pressed against her right knee, Noble half a yard behind. The grand staircase at this hour, with the lamps burning low, and the panelling deep with shadow, and the bust of Albert on its half landing in the soft glow of a single oil lamp set on the bracket above it. It is the moment in the castle's day when the Queen most distinctly feels herself to be in her husband's house. She has not, in 7 years, gone up these stairs in the late evening without the sense that he is somewhere ahead of her, or beside her, or behind her. She does not, at this point, find the sense distressing. She has had 7 years to grow accustomed to a presence in her life that is also an absence. She places her hand on the back of the bust's neck as she passes it. She continues to the top of the flight. On the first floor corridor, she turns east toward her own apartments. The corridor is darker than the staircase. The lamps here had been turned down by the housemaid an hour ago in preparation for the household coming up to bed. The carpet under her feet is a deeper royal Stuart than the one downstairs, and it absorbs the sound of her steps almost entirely. The dog's claws make faint clicks. The door of Princess Beatrice's room is ajar, with the nightlight burning inside on the chest of drawers, and the Queen pauses at the door and looks in. Beatrice is asleep, lying on her side, her face turned to the door, her dark hair on the pillow, her hand under her cheek. The nurse is in her own chair at the far side of the room with a piece of mending in her lap. The nurse looks up and rises. The Queen says, in a voice meant for the nurse and not for the child, "No, Mrs. Thurston, sit down, I am only looking." She crosses the room very softly. She bends over the sleeping child. She places her lips on the child's hair for half a heartbeat. Beatrice does not wake. The Queen straightens. She withdraws. She closes the door of Beatrice's room to the same fraction it was open before. She crosses to her own door. Her own room, the bedroom proper, is 20 feet by 18, with a window on the east wall and one on the south. The walls are papered in a pattern of small white sprigs on a pale green ground that Albert chose in 1855. The bed stands against the inner wall, a wide mahogany bedstead with hangings of the same green and white as the walls, made in Aberdeen in 1854, in which the Queen has slept every night. She has been at Balmoral for 13 years. The headboard has been carved with the family monogram by a craftsman in Edinburgh. The bedposts are of plain turned mahogany. The mattress is of the best horsehair, made by Heels in London, and brought up by rail and cart in the summer of 1855. The bedclothes have been turned down by the housemaid. The sheets are linen. The blankets are wool, 3 of them, with a coverlet of the green Balmoral wool over the top to the right of the bed, against the south wall, stands a chair of plain mahogany with a green velvet cushion. Folded over the back of the chair is a man's dressing gown of grey silk, lined in green, with the Prince Consort's monogram embroidered in silver thread at the breast. The dressing gown has been there since the morning of the 15th of December 1861. It has been moved between Balmoral and Windsor and Osborne with the Queen ever since, and in each of her 3 principal houses there is a chair beside her bed over which it is laid every evening before she goes up. The dressing gown is brushed weekly. The silver thread is polished by Mrs. MacDonald twice a year. The Queen does not, at any time, mention it to anyone. It is simply there. Beside the chair on a side table sits a photograph of Albert in a silver frame, the photograph taken by Mayle in 1860, of which there is another copy in the album downstairs. Beside the photograph sits a plaster cast of his right hand. The plaster cast was made by the sculptor John Steele in the days after Albert's death, from a mould taken of the hand in the bed in the Blue Room at Windsor, and it has stood beside the Queen's bed ever since. Mrs. MacDonald is waiting in the dressing room, which opens off the bedroom by a door on the inner wall. The fire in the dressing room has been kept up all evening by a housemaid, and the room is the warmest in the apartments. The Queen goes through. MacDonald begins the work of the night undressing. The brooch is removed and laid in its case. The widow's cap and the fall of crape are unpinned and laid on the table. The hair is taken down, brushed through. brushed again, and rebraided in the loose night braid that the Queen has worn since girlhood. The black gown is unhooked at the back and lifted off and hung. The stays are unlaced. The petticoats come down. The Queen stands in her shift and stockings. MacDonald brings the nightclothes from the warming rack by the fire where they have been since 6. A long nightgown of fine white linen with a deep flounce at the throat and at the wrists, plain in its trim except for a small tuck of black silk at the collar, which is the only mark of the Queen's mourning on her sleeping body. The nightgown goes on over the shift. A dressing jacket of quilted white silk, lined with flannel for the Highland nights, is laid over her shoulders. The stockings come off, and her feet go into a pair of soft kid slippers. The Queen looks at herself for a moment in the long mirror. She does not focus, in the way she does not focus at any mirror this side of 9:30 in the morning. She turns away. She returns to the bedroom. MacDonald follows with the warming pan, a brass warmer on a long handle filled with hot coals from the dressing-room fire, and she draws the warmer between the sheets at the foot of the bed for half a minute on each side, and then withdraws it. The bed is warm now to within a hand's breadth of the pillow. The Queen sits on the edge of the bed. She slips her feet out of the kid slippers. She swings her legs up. She sits propped against the pillows with the coverlet drawn to her waist. On the table beside the bed sit the things she will need before sleep. The journal of the day in its leather binding, with the brass-tipped quill laid across it. The cut-glass tumbler of water that is brought up every evening. A porcelain dish with 2 of the lozenges she takes for her cough. A second photograph of Albert, smaller than the one on the chair, in a silver frame on the table. A pair of reading spectacles which the Queen has begun to use in the past year for fine work, although she will not admit to needing them more generally. MacDonald lights the candle on the table from the candle she has carried in. She places the candle in its silver stick. She lays the snuffer beside it. She inclines her head. She says, "Will that be all, ma'am?" The Queen says, "Yes, MacDonald, thank you." MacDonald says, "Sleep well, ma'am," and goes out, and the door of the dressing-room closes behind her, and the fire in the bedroom is fed once more with a peat and a small piece of pine by the housemaid, who has come in to do the night's banking, and the housemaid bobs and withdraws, and the Queen is at last alone in her room with her dogs and her fire and her photographs and her journal. She does not, at once, take up the journal. She sits for a moment looking at the room. The fire moves. The wind that has come up since Brown predicted it is now properly against the windows, with a thin, steady rain on the glass. The curtains stir. The dogs are arranging themselves at the foot of the bed, sharp curled into the place he has used for 2 years, noble against him for warmth. The candle on the bedside table burns. The brass clock on the chimney shelf ticks. The room is, for the first time in 14 hours, simply hers. She thinks of Albert. She has, all day, been thinking of Albert in the underlayer of every other thought. Now, in the bed, alone, she lets the thinking come up out of the underlayer and become the surface. He died in the Blue Room at Windsor on the 14th of December 1861 of what was diagnosed at the time as typhoid fever, although later medical opinion has been less certain. He was 42. He had been ill for 15 days. The Queen had been with him at the end, sitting on the bed with the children and the doctors and the servants standing round, in a room that has not been altered in the 7 years since. The Queen has not, in the 7 years since, been able to remember the night of the 14th of December clearly. She remembers fragments, the candle on the chest, Albert's hand in hers, the small hour after midnight when the doctor said he had gone, the moment when she ran out of the room and could not be found for half an hour, and was discovered eventually in the corridor with her face against the wall. She remembers, more clearly, the first weeks afterwards, the numbness, the inability to make a decision, the terror of being seen by anyone. the mountain of black silk that arrived from the London shops in the first fortnight, in such quantities that her rooms could not hold it all. The 1,000 small disorderings of her household by the loss of the man who had ordered every detail of it for 21 years. She remembers the first Christmas at Osborne 3 weeks later, with the children and without him, in a house in which every clock had been stopped at 10 minutes to 11, the time of his death, and at which she had not been able to sit at the head of the dining-room table, because the chair across from her had been his. She remembers the first months of 1862 as a tunnel. She remembers also the thing she has chosen not to forget. She remembers Albert at Coburg when they were 6, the cousins meeting for the first time. She remembers Albert at Kensington when they were 16, on the visit at which they had been introduced as the future spouses they both already knew they were to be. She remembers Albert at the altar in St. James's Chapel on the 10th of February 1840, in the bottle green uniform of a British field marshal, his hair brushed back from his forehead, looking at her as she came up the aisle as if he could not quite believe he was being allowed to marry her. She remembers Albert in the gardens at Osborne in the long summer afternoons. She remembers Albert at the cradle of each of their 9 children. She remembers Albert at the Great Exhibition in 1851, watching the opening ceremony with tears on his cheeks. She remembers Albert in this room at Balmoral, in this bed, on the night the new castle opened in September 1855, holding her in his arms in the dark and saying, in his accented English, "My Vicky, this is the place." She thinks about all of this in the way that she has trained herself to think about it over 7 years, which is in fragments by the firelight, with the rain on the window, without crying. The crying she has done. She has done it for 7 years and continues to do it at intervals. She does not bother to count. Tonight is not a crying night. Tonight is one of the quieter Albert evenings, the ones in which he is with her in the room without producing pain. There are some evenings, almost a third of all evenings, in which the thinking of him is a kind of consolation rather than a kind of wound. The ratio has shifted over 7 years. In the first year, almost no consolation. By the 3rd year, perhaps 1 evening in 10. Now, in the 8th year, more than 1 in 3. She does not know what this means. She does not allow herself to think that the proportion will go on shifting. She has, in her deepest places, decided that the grief is to be lived with, in whatever form it takes from year to year, and not got over. The phrase getting over a death has, in fact, always struck her as an obscenity. She has used it once, in a letter to Vicky in 1864, in a sentence in which she said that she would never get over Albert and did not propose to be told to, and the sentence has been quoted back to her by Vicky in subsequent letters as a kind of motto. She takes up the journal, she uncaps the inkwell, she begins to write the entry for the day. She writes in the same hand she has since her teens. The firm sloped writing that has been seen by half her ministers in marginal comments on cabinet papers, and by half her family in private letters, and by her own future biographers in the journals of her life. She begins with the weather. Dull morning, sun out by 10. Walked to Crathy with the dogs and Brown. Saw Mrs. Robertson, the minister's wife, who told me about the harvest Thanksgiving. Read dispatches before luncheon. Lunched with Louise and Beatrice and Lady Churchill. Wrote letters in the afternoon. Walk along the Dee with Brown at 4. The river at a fine height. Salmon brought up by Sandy Stewart. Dressed at 6:30. Wrote to dear Vicky. Dinner at 8, with Dr. Robertson of Crathy as guest. The Schubert and Mendelssohn after dinner. The pipes, the Sky Boat song. Very fine. Dr. Robertson in tears. To the drawing room. Conversation. The books of photographs. To bed. The journal entry is short. They mostly are. She has over the years learned that the journal is best kept as a daily armature, with the longer descriptions reserved for special occasions and the bulk of the rest as a brief functional record. The Highland journal that was published in January contains only the longer passages selected by her with the help of her librarian Sir Arthur Helps over the past 3 years. The everyday entries that surround them have not been published and are kept in the bookcase upstairs at Windsor with the rest of the journals. She finishes the entry. She closes the book. She caps the inkwell. She lays the quill on the table. She does not blow the candle out at once. She lies back against the pillows and looks at the ceiling. The fire moves. The wind drives the rain against the window in a long wet pulse. The dogs are deep into their first sleep at her feet. She thinks about the day she has had. The walk to Crathy this morning. The faint flutter at her chest as she came up. The hill from the bridge over the burn, which has been there for 2 years and which she has not mentioned to her physician. The Mistress Wife in the lane, who is 42 and has 6 children and looks 10 years older than the Queen does. The light on Lochnagar at noon as she came back down the path. The luncheon with the girls, at which Beatrice had spilled her milk and Louise had laughed, and the dogs had gone for the milk on the floor before the footman could get a cloth to it. The afternoon at her desk. The walk with Brown along the river, at which Brown had said nothing for nearly 20 minutes, and then had remarked in his level voice that he had seen the Ghillies boy from the Mar Lodge, who was thought to have been lost in the August storm, and who had now come back and was working at the Fife Arms. The Queen had been startled. She had asked Brown what had become of the boy in the missing weeks. Brown had said, with the faint movement of the eyebrow that he uses for the things he does not propose to discuss, that the boy had gone over the hill to a girl. The Queen had said, she had said no more. The matter had passed between them with the unspoken understanding of 2 people who have been walking in the same Highland country for 14 years. She thinks about Brown for a moment. She thinks about what he has been to her and what he has not been in the 7 years since Albert died. She does not at this date allow herself to think too long about any of this. She has, very deliberately, not entered into the kind of self-examination on the subject that her elder children and her ministers have repeatedly attempted to provoke. She knows what he is to her. She knows what he is not. She knows what would have to be true for the music hall jokes to be even partly justified, and she knows that none of those things are true, and she knows that she will not justify herself to anyone, and so she does not. In the abstract way she allows herself, he is the friend who has come into her life after the only friend she had ever needed was taken. More concretely, he is the man who knows the Highland country in a way she has wanted to know it for 20 years and could never have known it from a carriage, and in a very brief shape that she lets up and lets go of again. He is a man twice her physical size who has, more than once, put his hand under her elbow on a steep descent in a way that has reminded her that her body, which is 49 and short and dumpy and the body of a widow, is still also a body. She does not, at this date, let the thought stay. She allows it to come up briefly and to pass. She is content with what she has chosen, and she does not need to interrogate it. She thinks about Beatrice in the room next door. She thinks about Louise across the corridor. She thinks about Bertie in Norfolk and Vicky in Berlin and Affy at sea somewhere off Australia this autumn, and Alice in Hesse and Helena in Cumberland, and Arthur at Woolwich and Leopold at Windsor. She thinks about her grandchildren, of whom she has now 12, scattered across 3 countries and the Mediterranean. She thinks about her cousins in Coburg, in Berlin, in Hanover. She thinks about Princess Vicky's son Wilhelm, who is 9, and who has a withered left arm from a difficult birth, and whose temperament is causing his mother concern. The Queen, who has not met the child since he was 4, thinks about him with the particular protective tenderness she reserves for the grandchildren she cannot reach. He will grow up. He will, although the Queen will not live to see it, become Kaiser Wilhelm II of Germany, and will set in motion, in 1914, the great catastrophe that will end the world she has made. She does not know any of this. She thinks of him tonight as a thoughtful boy, whose mother loves him, and whose left arm is a private grief. Her uncles come up in her mind. King George IV, who died when she was 11, who had taken her on his knee at Royal Lodge in Windsor in 1826 and given her a piece of cake. King William IV, who succeeded him, who was on the throne when she was a child at Kensington, and who had been kind to her in his rough way, and whose queen, Adelaide, had loved her, and had been one of the few adults of her childhood she had not been afraid of. Her mother, the Duchess of Kent, who died 7 months before Albert, and whose death she has sometimes felt was the breach in the wall of her life through which the rest came. Her father, the Duke of Kent, who died when she was 8 months old, and whom she does not remember. Sir John Conroy, the household tyrant of her childhood, who had been the architect of the Kensington system that had kept her isolated and supervised through every hour of her growing years, and whom she had removed from her household on the morning of her accession at the age of 18, with one of the first orders she ever gave as Queen. She does not think of Conroy with anger any more. She has been Queen for 31 years, and a widow for 7, and the fierce resentments of her early life have, with most of the great griefs, been folded into the quiet country of her middle age. Her uncle King Leopold of the Belgians, her mother's brother, who had advised her and Albert through the whole of their early marriage, and who died in 1865 at the age of 74, the last of the parental generation of her family, her half-sister Theodora in Germany, who has been writing to her about her own grandchildren, the long thread of her family across Europe, the dozens of princes and princesses she is related to, the courts at which her children have been placed, the languages spoken in those courts which include her own native German, alongside French and English. She is, as she has thought before, the centre of a web that runs across the whole continent, and the web is the great achievement of her marriage to Albert, who had planned it. Whether it will hold the peace of Europe through the next generations is, in the autumn of 1868, an open question. She has done what she can. She thinks about herself at 18 on the morning of the 20th of June 1837, when she had been woken at Kensington at 6 in the morning by her mother and Baroness Lexon, with the news that her uncle William had died in the night and that she was the Queen. She had received the Privy Council that morning at 11 in a plain black dress, alone, the first sovereign of either sex to receive the council without an adult of the previous generation by her side, and she had impressed the entire body of them, including the Duke of Wellington, with the composure she had shown. She had been 5 feet tall. She had been 18 years and 1 month old. She remembers the morning as clearly as she remembers the morning of her wedding 3 years later, and she remembers her wedding as clearly as she remembers the morning of her widowhood 21 years after that, and she is tonight, in her bed at Balmoral, the same woman in the same body with the same memory. The throne has been hers for 31 years. It will be hers for another 33. She lets the thoughts run on. She does not try to organize them. The mind at this hour wants to drift, and she has learned, over many years of going to bed at her own pace, that letting the mind drift is what allows sleep to come. The harvest at Crathy this past month. The cattle in the home park, which were brought down from the high pastures in the 3rd week of September, and are now in the fold below the bridge. The heather, gone now to its rust colour, which will hold its colour through October before fading to the dun grey of winter. The deer on the hill, which the Ghillies have been watching all summer for the stalking season and which are now in their best condition of the year. The salmon in the Dee, running well this September after a wet August. The great wedge of fish that Sandy Stewart brought in this afternoon. The way the cook had it in the kitchen by 3:30, the way it had appeared on the table at 8 in a sauce that has not been altered since 1855. The kitchen below stairs with its great range and its long pine table and its rows of copper pans. The cook, Mrs. Cameron, who has been at Balmoral every season since the new castle opened, and who is 61, and whose feet have given her trouble since the spring, and whom the Queen has been considering pensioning at the end of next summer. She lets her mind drift up through the castle. She thinks about the rooms above her on the second floor, the lodging rooms of the senior household, where Lady Churchill is now undressing, and General Grey is reading a dispatch by candlelight, and Sir Thomas Biddulph has already gone to bed. She thinks about the rooms above those, on the third floor, where the equerries and the maids of honour sleep when there are maids of honour in residence. She thinks about the attic floor, the floor under the slates of the great central tower, where the lower servants sleep in the narrow rooms that the architects designed for them in 1854, the housemaids in their rooms in twos, the kitchen maids in their dormitory at the back, the footmen in their corridor, the gardeners in their cottage outside, but the inside men in their attic. She thinks about the housekeeper in her own room on the second floor, Mrs. Skerritt, until last year, and now Mrs. McAllister, who came up from Osborne in the spring. She thinks about the steward in his room near the gun-room. She thinks about the household below stairs at this hour, settling. The kitchen has been at its work since 5 this morning, and is now closing. The pots have been scoured. The fires have been raked down to their banking. The cook has gone up to her own room. The 2 scullery maids are on their final round of the kitchen floor with the long-handled mops. The butler McGregor is at his desk in the silver pantry with the inventory book open in front of him, counting in the silver that has been used at dinner and locking it back into the great oak chests. The hall boy is mending a wick in the lamp room. The boot boy has finished the boots for the morning and has gone up. The pages have made their rounds. The footmen, who have been on their feet for 14 hours since 5 this morning, are sitting down at last in the servants' hall to a late supper of bread and cheese and a glass of beer. The hour at which a great house of this kind is fully closed, with every fire banked and every door bolted and every silver candlestick locked away, is approaching now and will be reached at about 11. By midnight the castle below the first floor will be entirely asleep. The Queen, in her bed, thinks about the small army of people whose labour through the day has been what made her own day possible. She has, all her life, had this army around her. She has not, all her life, thought as much as she might about what it took for the army to be at its work. She has thought more about it since Albert, who had taken an interest in such matters from a German rationalist standpoint that the Queen had not entirely shared at the time, the cook in her room going to bed, McGregor with his inventory, the housemaids who will be in this room at 6 in the morning to clean the grate and lay the new fire, MacDonald in the next room, still up although she will not be up for much longer, who will be in here at 7:30 with the hot water, the Ghillies in their cottages along the road, the keeper in his cottage at the head of the glen, the new boy at the Fife Arms who has come back from over the hill, the village of Crathy, of which she knows by name each family of the Kirk congregation, the manse where Dr. Robertson is now back at home, and where Mrs. Robertson is making him a cup of tea before they go up. She thinks of John Brown in his cottage. The cottage is 1/2 mile down the road, a stone cottage built for the keeper in 1840, given to Brown by the Queen in 1865 when she made him her Highland servant, in which Brown lives by himself. His mother visits him from the bush farm on Saturdays. The cottage has, this evening, a fire burning in the kitchen and a candle in the upper window. Brown is at his own pipe and his own small dram, sitting by the fire with the kitchen door open onto the night, looking out at the rain. She thinks of him with the unforced affection she has for him, and which has caused her so much trouble, and which she will not relinquish. She wishes him a good night in her mind. She moves on. Beyond Brown's cottage, the rest of the village of Crathy is asleep. The cottages of the estate workers are dark. The kirk on its mound is dark. The manse is the last lit window in the village. Dr. Robertson and his wife are still up by their fire, and Mrs. Robertson is telling him about the Harvest Thanksgiving Committee meeting from yesterday afternoon, and he is half listening and half thinking about the sermon he must write tomorrow on the parable of the labourers in the vineyard. Beyond the village, the road runs down the valley of the Dee toward Ballater 7 miles east, and along the road are the farms of the Upper Dee side, the Bush farm, where Brown's mother lives with her widowed daughter-in-law, Brown's brother's wife, with the 4 grandchildren who run round the yard, the lodge at Birkhall where Princess Alice and her husband stayed last autumn, the manse of Glenmuick further up the side glen, the keeper's cottage at the head of Loch Muick, the shieling above the loch where the Ghillies have their summer hut. All of these are dark now. The wind drives the rain up the valley. The river runs. Further out, beyond the parish, the Highlands spread in every direction in their great, empty dark. To the west, the Cairngorm Massif rises into Brariac and Cairntoul and Ben Macdui, dark mountains under their shoulder of summer-fading heather, and their first dusting of autumn snow on the high tops. To the north, the country falls away to Strathspey and Inverness. To the south, the long road runs over the Camwell Pass to Blair Athol and the lowlands. To the east, the Dee runs to Aberdeen and the North Sea. The country at this hour is, in a way that the Queen will live long enough to see end, and that her son will live to see ended, almost entirely empty of human noise. There are no railways within 15 miles. There is no electric light west of Aberdeen. The hills hold their silence in the way the hills have held their silence since the clearances cleared out the people of them in the early decades of the century. The wind, the rain, the deer moving on the high ground, the owls, the cold burn running over its stones at the bottom of the corrie, the sky above the cloud full of stars that nobody is looking at. The Queen, in her bed in the castle, has begun to feel the first weight of sleep coming over her. She has not quite caught it yet. She is at the stage of sleep approach in which the eyes are still open and the body is still aware of itself, but the mind has begun to loosen its grip on its own ordering. She does not, at this stage, fight the loosening. She has learned over many years that the way to sleep at her age is to let the mind go where it wants and not to chase it. What rises in her mind first, in the loosening, is the present moment. The room she is in, the bed she is in, the fact that Beatrice is next door in her own bed, breathing in the dark, with her nurse, Mrs. Thurston, on her chair across the room. The fact that Louise is across the corridor in her own bed, the sketch of the view from her window finished and laid on her desk for the morning. The fact that Lady Churchill, her friend of 19 years, is on the floor above with her own candle just put out. The fact that John Brown is half a mile down the road in his cottage, with his own fire banked under its ash and his own candle out. The fact that the dogs are at the foot of her bed. The fact that the house she is in was built for her by the husband she loved, and that every detail of every room in it was chosen by him with her in mind. The fact that she is, for the next 8 hours, simply allowed to be here, in this bed, in this room, in this house, in this valley, with these people around her, in a country that, although it does not always know it, loves her. That is a very great deal to be given on a single Highland night, and she has, over the past several years, learned to recognise it as such. There was a time when she could not have. There was a time, in the first years after Albert went, when no quantity of comfort around her could quite reach the cold place inside her where his absence sat, and she had moved through the rooms of her houses in those years, feeling as though everything in them had been arranged for somebody else. That has passed. It has not passed completely. She does not pretend that it has, but it has passed enough that on a night like this one, with the fire moving and the rain on the window and the long-known shape of the day finished, she can lie in the bed her husband chose for her and feel, properly and without protest, the warmth of it. The line of monarchs of which she is a member. She is not, on this question, sentimental. She knows the line. Her great-great-great-grandfather was George I, who came over from Hanover in 1714 and could not speak English. Her great-great-grandfather was George II. Her great-grandfather was Frederick, Prince of Wales, who died before he could become king. Her grandfather was George III, who lived to be 81 and reigned for 60 years and lost America. Her uncles were George IV and William IV. She is herself, in the order, the 6th Hanoverian sovereign of Britain, and after her will come her son, who will be a Saxe-Coburg, the first of the new line. The country is in good hands. Eventually, the world is changing under her. She has been changing with it for some time. She is not afraid of any of it. She thinks about gratitude. She thinks very deliberately about what she has been given, the marriage, the children, the houses, the throne, which she did not ask for, and which she has tried to discharge as Albert taught her, the Highland country, which she has come to love as the place in the world where she is most herself, the published journal, which has given her, in this last year, the sense that she is at last understood by her own people, the friendship of Mr. Disraeli, which is new and which has lightened a year that began heavily, the presence of Beatrice next door, breathing in the dark, the presence of Brown half a mile down the road in his cottage by his fire, the presence of the dogs at the foot of her bed, the fire in the grate, the warmth of the bed, the rain on the window, the wind on the roof, the dressing gown of grey silk on the chair, with its empty arms folded, waiting. She thinks about Albert. She thinks not of his death, but of his living. Albert in the room they shared at Coburg in their courtship visit of 1839, when she had been 20 and he 20 also, and they had sat by a window in the morning with a book between them, and he had translated the German passages for her in his accented English. His hand on her arm at the door of St. James's Chapel in 1840 as they came out into the air after the wedding. Albert beside her in this bed in this room in October 1855, the first autumn at the new castle, when they had lain awake half the night, listening to the rain on the new Aberdeenshire slates and laughing, because he had told her, 3 times since dinner, that the slates had been laid by a man who had had to be paid extra for working in the wet. Albert at Frogmore in the Gardens in 1850, in the year he was planning the great exhibition, walking with her and explaining what the Crystal Palace would look like, and using a stick to draw the proportions in the gravel of the path. Albert in the corridor at Windsor in the autumn of 1861, 2 months before he died, when he had stopped in front of her and put his hand on her cheek and said in his quiet way that he was glad they had been each other's lives. She has lived on that sentence for 7 years. She has not had to write it down to remember it. She will not forget it. She thinks about the country she has reigned over. She thinks about her people, who are scattered now from her own islands to the ends of the earth in the empire her ministers manage in her name. She has been queen for 31 years. She has reigned over the abolition of slavery in the colonies, over the Crimean War, over the Indian Mutiny, over the famine in Ireland, over the rise and the still rising of the great industrial cities, over the railways spreading their iron across the country, over the telegraph cables now running under the Atlantic to America, over the publication of Mr. Darwin's book, and the building of the new Houses of Parliament, and the opening of the Underground Railway in London. She has been the symbol under which her country has done all of this. She has, in her widow's blacks, become more than a queen. She has, although she would not allow it to be said in front of her, become the matriarch of the nation. Tonight, in her bed, She lets herself feel this without protesting against it. There are some hours in which a woman of 49, who is also the symbol of an empire, may be permitted to feel that she has earned her rest. She thinks, finally, about the small contentments of being where she is. The fire that has just been fed by the housemaid is now burning steadily under its peat. The smell of the peat in the room is the smell she most associates with the Highland evenings of her life, and it is, in her mind at this hour, as much a part of Albert as the photograph on the table beside her bed. The dogs at the foot of the bed are breathing in the long settled rhythm of dogs who have been with the same person for years and have learned the shape of her evenings. The wind that came up earlier is now properly on the roof, with the rain steady on the slates, and there is, in the long memory of any Highlander, no sound so completely associated with the safety of indoors as the sound of a Highland rain on a Highland roof when you are warm in the bed. She is warm in the bed. She is exactly where she most wants to be. She is, at this hour, the most fortunate woman in the British Isles, and although she would not have phrased it that way, the feeling of it has reached her in the loosening of the mind before sleep, in a way she does not need to put words to. She lifts the snuffer from the bedside table. She brings it to the candle. She lowers it over the flame. The flame dies. The room goes from the ring of yellow light around the bed to the deep red glow of the fire alone. The room in the firelight is the room she will sleep in. The walls are not visible. The ceiling is not visible. The window is a pale grey rectangle in the wall, with the rain still on it, beyond which the dark of the Highland night is absolute. The dogs at the foot of the bed are two black and white shapes against the green of the coverlet. The chair beside the bed, with the dressing gown over the back, is a shadow against the pale papered wall. The photograph on the table is invisible. The plaster cast is invisible. The clock on the chimney-piece is invisible. But the tick is the chief thing in the room now that the candle has gone out, and the tick fills the room in the way a fire fills a room with its light. She lies on her back. She slides a little further down into the bed. She draws the coverlet up to her chin. She closes her eyes. The breathing goes long. The shoulders drop. The hand that has been at her chest goes flat on the coverlet beside her. The other hand, the right hand, finds its place under her cheek on the pillow, in the position she has slept in since she was a child at Kensington. The dogs settle deeper. The fire moves once more, a peat falling, a faint thump, and then settles. You sleep well tonight. You sleep the way the Queen is about to sleep. You let the day be done. You let the matters of the day be done. You let the people you have been thinking about go their own way through the night without your having to attend to them. You let the rain on the window be the rain on your window. You let the fire be the fire in your grate. You let the wind on the roof be the wind on your roof. The Highland night is around the castle, and the castle is around the Queen, and the Queen is in her bed, and her breathing is going long. The light in Brown's cottage half a mile down the road goes out at this moment, as Brown himself stretches and yawns and reaches across to snuff the candle on the kitchen table, and rises and goes up the narrow stair to his own bed in the chamber at the top of the house. The mouse window in the village goes out shortly afterwards as Dr. Robertson sets his sermon aside, unfinished, and goes up to bed to his wife. The lamps along the first-floor corridor of the castle are being turned down by the page on his last round. The kitchens below stairs are dark. The servants' hall is empty. The footmen have gone up to their attic rooms by the back stair, where they have already pulled the coarse linen sheets over themselves and are asleep in the simple, immediate way of working men at the end of a 14-hour day. The housemaids in their twos are in their narrow beds under the slates, breathing in the thin air of the attic, listening to the rain on the slates above them. The cook is asleep in her room. Mrs. MacDonald has just blown out her own candle in the narrow chamber that opens off the dressing-room corridor and is settling into her own bed. The whole castle has, in the half hour since the Queen blew out her candle, drawn its great granite walls closer around its sleeping people, and the rooms below the first floor have gone entirely to sleep, and the rooms above the first floor have gone entirely to sleep, and the first floor itself is full of the breathing of the family and the senior household, and the castle is closed. Now, you sleep well. You sleep the way the castle is sleeping. You sleep the way the village is sleeping. You sleep the way the gillies and the keepers and the housemaids and the cooks and the queens and the dogs are sleeping. The whole valley, the Dee, from the head of Loch Muick to the bridge at Crathy to the cottages along the road to Ballater, is in its sleep. The river is running past in the dark, the way rivers run. The wind is in the pines. The rain is on the slates. There is no light in the whole valley except for a single lamp in the watchman's lodge at the foot of the drive, where the night watchman is reading a newspaper and drinking a cup of tea. The Queen sleeps. The breath comes long and deep. The face on the pillow has in sleep the smoothness that her waking face does not have. The widow's lines at the corner of the mouth have softened. The shoulders are relaxed under the linen of the nightgown. The hand under the cheek is curled, palm up, in the way of a child. The dogs at the foot of the bed have gone into the deep sleep of dogs by a fire. The fire glows. The clock ticks. The night holds. Good night. Good night, my dear. Good night to the woman in the bed, and to the dogs at her feet, and to the daughter sleeping in the room next door, and to the daughter across the corridor, and to the friend who has been her friend for 19 years asleep on the floor above, and to the man who has been her companion for 7 years asleep in his cottage down the road. Good night to the cook, and to the dresser, and to the housekeeper, and to the butler, and to the housemaids, and to the pages, and to the gillies, and to the keepers, and to the gardeners, and to the piper. Good night to the gillies' wives in their cottages along the road, and to their children asleep beside them. Good night to the minister at the manse, and to his wife. Good night to the boy at the Fife Arms, who went over the hill to a girl and came back. Good night to the deer on the high ground above the loch, and to the salmon in the pool above the iron bridge. Good night to the cattle in the home fold. Good night to the night watchman in his lodge. Good night to the rain on the slates, and to the wind in the pines, and to the river running past in the dark. Sleep. Sleep the way she is sleeping. Sleep the way the castle is sleeping. Sleep the way the Highland night is sleeping. Sleep. The night goes on. The castle holds. There is a moment, somewhere around 1:30, when the rain on the slates eases off to a fine drizzle and the wind drops, and the silence of the valley comes back through the windows in the way a Highland silence comes back after a Highland weather has passed. There is a moment around 2 when a stag belling on the high pasture above Loch Muick can be heard faintly in the bedroom of the Queen on the first floor of the castle, and Sharp at the foot of the bed lifts his head for 1 heartbeat and sets it down again because the stag is 2 miles off and is not his concern. There is a moment around 3 when the watchman at the foot of the drive makes his round of the perimeter of the castle, walking with a horn lantern up the gravel and back, and the light of the lantern shows briefly on the window of the gun-room before passing on. The valley sleeps. The deer come down from the high ground in their pairs and threes to feed in the lower meadows under the cover of the dark, the way they have come down every September night for 10,000 years. The salmon hold in the pools of the Dee, motionless against the current, the way salmon hold. The pine marten and the badger and the wildcat go about their separate businesses in the woods above the river. An owl is calling, the same tawny owl that called all evening from his tree above the kirk at Crathy. The wind drops further. The clouds thin. By 4 in the morning, the first stars are showing through breaks in the cloud above Lochnagar. In the village, the dark holds. The cottages of the Ghillies are square dark shapes along the road. In one of them, the Westerwood cottage, John Brown is asleep on his right side in the iron bedstead. He has slept in for 3 years, the curtain of his bed half drawn, the fire in the kitchen below banked under its ash. In another of them, the cottage of Sandy Stewart, who brought up the salmon. Sandy and his wife are asleep with their youngest child between them, and the older 2 children in the bed across the room, and the gun and the rod hung on their pegs against the wall, and the wet leather waders on the hearthstone steaming in front of the banked fire. In another, the cottage of the head keeper, the man is awake briefly because he has had a dream of his father and is sitting up in the dark with his hand on his wife's shoulder. And his wife has woken and asked him, "What is the matter?" And he has said only, "My mother." And she has said, "Go to sleep." And he has lain down again. In another, the cottage of the parish schoolmaster, Mr. Anderson. The master himself is at his desk in the front parlour by a single candle, although it is past midnight, because he has been correcting the slates of the senior class for tomorrow, and has only this hour finished. He is 34, a lowland man from Stirlingshire, who came to Crathy 3 years ago to take the school after the previous master retired, who has 32 pupils on his roll this term, and who has, in his neat hand, completed the recording of each child's progress in the morning's arithmetic and the morning's reading. He caps his ink. He pinches out the candle. He sits a heartbeat in the dark before he rises, because the room is warm and he is, at 34 after a long day, glad of the moment of stillness. He thinks, as he sits, about the boy McIntyre who has the best mathematical head of any boy he has taught in the parish, and whom he has been writing to a friend in Aberdeen about, to see whether there is a way to send the boy to the Burg School there on a bursary. The boy's father is a stonemason, and the family has the money for boots but not for the Burg School, and Mr. Anderson has been working at the question for 2 months. He thinks the friend will say yes. He hopes the friend will say yes. He rises in the dark and goes upstairs to his bed, where his wife is already asleep, with their first child, a girl of 14 months, in the cradle by the window. In another, the cottage of Mrs. Cameron the midwife, who is the woman the parish calls to every birth and to most of the laying out of the dead. The candle still burns because she is sitting up with a young woman in the back room who is in the early hours of her first labour. The young woman is 17 and has been married 6 months. The labour is not yet at its hard work. It is in the long opening stretch which Mrs. Cameron knows from 40 years of attending to the matter is best handled by talk and tea and the warmth of the fire. The husband is at the kitchen table downstairs with his head on his arms, asleep over a cup of tea that has long since gone cold. Mrs. Cameron, 61, is in the chair beside the bed with her knitting on her lap and her own cup of tea on the floor beside her, and she is telling the young woman about the birth of her own first child in 1832, which was a long one, which had a happy ending, and which is the story Mrs. Cameron tells every young woman in this position, partly because it is true, and partly because it is what she has found over 40 years to be the most comforting thing in the world to a young woman in early labour. The child in question, who is to be born to the 17-year-old some time after dawn tomorrow, will be a daughter, will be christened Margaret, will marry a Crathy blacksmith in 1888, will have 9 children of her own, and will outlive the Queen by 20 years. None of this is known yet. Tonight, Mrs. Cameron knits, and the young woman lies on her side and listens, and the candle by the bed burns on, and the cottage holds them both. In the manse, Dr. Robertson is asleep in his own bed beside his wife. The unfinished sermon is on the desk in his study downstairs with a stone on top of it to keep the air from moving the pages. He will write it tomorrow morning between 7 and 11. He will preach it on Sunday. The Queen will be in the kirk at the Bush Farm, where Brown's mother lives with his brother's wife and his brother's 4 children. The mother of John Brown is asleep in the bed she has slept in for 48 years. She is 71. She has buried her husband 3 years ago and is now the matriarch of the farm. She has by her bed a framed photograph of John in his Highland dress, taken at Balmoral by the Queen's photographer in 1865, the year he became Highland servant. She does not know that the Queen, in the castle 3 miles down the road, has been thinking of her son tonight. At the inn at Crathy, the Fife Arms, the boy who came back over the hill from his girl is asleep in the loft above the stable, with his coat over him for an extra blanket, and his face turned away from the high window in the gable, and a thin smile in his sleep because he is dreaming of the girl. He will not in the event marry her. He will marry instead a girl from the next parish, and will be a forester on the estate for 40 years, and will outlive the Queen herself by a quarter of a century. None of this is known yet. He sleeps with his small dreaming smile, and the loft holds him, and the night holds the loft. Further out, beyond the parish, the Highlands hold their wider darkness. The roads are empty. The drove roads that have been walked for 1,000 years by men driving cattle from the high country down to the markets of the lowlands are empty now in October, the autumn drove having gone south last month. The sheilings on the high ground are deserted, their summer fires cold, their thatch in disrepair. The Highland country has, since the clearances, been an emptier country than it was in the time of the Queen's grandfather. The villages along the side glens have been reduced to a fraction of their former populations. The old families have gone, some to Glasgow and Edinburgh, more to Canada and Australia and New Zealand and the United States. The Queen, who has read about all of this, and who has talked about it with Brown and with the Ghillies, knows that she lives in a country that has been emptied, and she knows that her husband had felt this keenly, and she knows that the Balmoral she loves is a Balmoral built on top of a more populated and rougher Balmoral of 40 years before. She does not, when she thinks about it, romanticize it. She holds it as a fact about the country. But on a night in late September of 1868, in the moments between midnight and dawn, the empty country is one of the great quiet places of the world. The wind that has dropped is moving very gently in the tops of the pines. The cold burn in the corrie above the loch is running over its stones. The cold of the autumn night is settling on the heather. The first frost of the year, which Brown predicted, has come faintly to the lower ground in patches, and the lawn outside the castle is white in places where the frost has touched it. By dawn the frost will be gone with the rising sun. The castle holds. Inside it, the breathing of the sleeping 40 people who are in residence tonight is the steady rhythm of a great house at peace. The fires in the bedrooms have all banked themselves under their ash. The lamps in the corridors are out except for the single oil lamp on the half landing and under the bust of Albert, which is kept burning all night by long-established household rule. The clocks in the principal rooms tick the half-hours in concert. The dogs in the Queen's bedroom sleep. The pages in the corridors sleep. The footmen in their attics sleep. The kitchen below stairs is dark and silent, except for the kettle on the side of the range, with a low fire under it, which the night porter keeps warm against the watchman's needs. And while the castle holds and the valley sleeps and the Highlands keep their wide quiet, the rest of the world the Queen has been thinking of in the hours before her own sleep is at its own night, business at its own latitudes. In Berlin, where it is 2 hours later than Aberdeenshire, the Crown Princess Vicky is in bed in the Neues Palais at Potsdam, awake at 4 in the morning because her youngest son Waldemar has a cough that she has been listening to from across the corridor, and she has gone twice to look at him in the past 2 hours, and she has now resigned herself to a wakeful end of the night. She is 28. She has, on the table beside her bed, her mother's last letter, which arrived in the post yesterday, which she has read 3 times. The letter mentions Sigismund. The letter has helped. She thinks of her mother in the Highland castle, which she has not seen since the summer of 1862. She thinks of Brown, whom she dislikes for complicated reasons, and about whom she has come to a private peace this past year. She thinks of England. She turns out her own lamp at last, and goes back to sleep on the assurance that Waldemar's cough is no worse. In Darmstadt, where it is also after 3, the Princess Alice is awake at the bedside of her eldest daughter, who is 5 years old this April, and who has had the croup since last Sunday, and Alice has been at the bedside in shifts with the German nurse for 4 nights running. Alice writes to her mother almost every day. Alice has not yet written about the croup because she has not wanted to worry her mother, and she has been managing the household through it on her own with the help of the German nurse and a friend from the town. The child's breathing has eased in the past hour. Alice sits in the chair beside the bed with her hand on the coverlet over her daughter, and she is half dozing, half watching. She is 25. She will, although her mother does not know it yet, be the first of the Queen's children to die, in 1878 at the age of 35, of the same diphtheria that will kill this very daughter a fortnight before. None of this is known yet. Tonight the breathing eases. The child sleeps. Alice watches. In Norfolk, where it is past 1 and the night is clear and cold, Bertie the Prince of Wales is at Sandringham in his own house. In the bedroom he shares with the Princess of Wales, who is 23 and has been his wife for 5 years, and who is asleep beside him. Bertie himself is awake. He is awake because he has come up to bed at midnight and has not yet been able to sleep, which has been a frequent matter for him since the spring. He is 27. He has in the room with him a Skye Terrier that the Princess gave him for his birthday, who is asleep on the rug. He thinks, in the dark, about his mother in Scotland. He thinks about whether to write to her. He thinks that he should. He thinks that he will in the morning. He will, in fact, not only write, he will write the morning after. The letter, when it comes, will not say what he wishes it would say, but it will say something, and the Queen will receive it at Balmoral, and she will read it twice, and she will sit at her desk for 10 minutes before she writes back, and the long careful repair of the breach between mother and son will, although neither of them yet knows it, advance a measurable distance. At Windsor, where it is past 1, Prince Leopold is asleep in his own bed in his apartments on the 2nd floor of the upper ward, with the nightlight burning in the corner and the nurse in the next room on her chair, with her own knitting on her lap and a cup of tea cold beside her. The boy is 15. He has had no bleeding for 10 days, which is, by the standard of his life, a long stretch. His tutor, Mr. Duckworth, has sent his report up to Balmoral this morning, and it should reach the Queen tomorrow by the 2nd post. The report says that Leopold has been well, has eaten well, has read a good deal, has corresponded with his mother daily, and is in good spirits. The report does not mention that Leopold last week told his governess that he wished he could be sent away to a school like Eton, where the other boys go. The governess has not mentioned it because the matter has been agitated before, and the Queen has been firm that Leopold's haemophilia makes any normal schoolboy life impossible, and there is no point distressing the Queen with a wish that cannot be granted. Leopold himself, in his bed at this hour, is asleep on his right side with his hand folded under his cheek, in the way the Queen herself is sleeping, 300 miles to the north, in a castle he has never seen. At Osborne, on the Isle of Wight, where the autumn has come more gently than to the Highlands, the house is empty of the family but full of its staff, who are giving it a thorough autumn cleaning before the Queen returns there for Christmas. The housekeeper is asleep. The under-housemaids are asleep in their dormitory. The estate is dark. The Solent runs past the bottom of the garden in a calm tide. The blue room at Windsor, by contrast, is locked and dark, and has been at this hour every night since the 15th of December 1861. The room is kept by the Queen's order exactly as it was on the morning Albert died. His clothes are laid out daily on the bed by a housemaid who has been doing this for 7 years and will continue to do so for 33 more. The water is brought up daily for the basin in the corner. The candles on the table are replaced when they have burned down, even though they are never lit. The room is, in the deepest sense the Queen has, his room, and she has not opened the door to it in 3 years. Across the empire, the night is at its various hours. In Calcutta, it is just after 7 in the morning, and the sun is up over the Hooghly, and the bullocks are moving in the streets. In Sydney, it is just before noon, and the Parliament of New South Wales is sitting under a blue early summer sky. In Vancouver Island, it is just before 5 in the afternoon, and the loggers are coming in from the camps. In Cape Town, it is past 3 in the morning, and the city sleeps. In Wellington, it is past 2 in the afternoon. In Bombay, it is past 6 in the morning. The British Empire on the late evening of the 23rd of September 1868 covers about a quarter of the Earth's land surface and 1 in 5 of the world's people. The single thread that runs through the whole of it is the woman asleep in the bed in the castle in the Highland Valley. She does not know, at this hour, that anyone in any of those places is thinking of her. They are. Tonight, as on every night, there are people from Auckland to Halifax who are reading her published journal by their own bedsides, and who are imagining the very castle in which she is now sleeping. The empire is held together in the late 19th century, partly by trade, and partly by armies, and partly by telegraph cables, and partly, in a way that her ministers do not quite know how to acknowledge, by the simple fact that she is alive in it, and is loved in it. The night in the valley of the Dee deepens toward the small hours that are the deepest. Between 3 and 4 in the morning, the cold sharpens, the frost on the lawn outside the castle thickens, and the stars above Lochnagar come out in their full cold autumn brilliance through the clearing cloud. Orion is up to the southeast, rising. The plough stands over the chimney of the keeper's cottage at Crathy. The Milky Way crosses the sky in a band of pale grey light from horizon to horizon. The Highland sky at this hour, in any year, in any century, is the same sky. The Queen, who does not see it from her bed, has seen it many times from the windows of this castle in the long years she has been coming here. She stirs once, around 4. It is not a waking, it is the brief adjustment of a sleeping body, the turning of a shoulder, the moving of a hand. The right hand, tucked under her cheek for 3 hours, has gone numb, and she shifts onto her back, drawing the arm down to lie along the coverlet, and her head rolls into the cooler hollow of the pillow. She does not wake. Sharp at the foot of the bed lifts his head at the movement and lays it down again. The fire is now down to its deep red bed under a thick layer of ash. The clock in the room shows 4 minutes past 4. The dressing gown of grey silk has not moved on its chair. The photograph of Albert on the bedside table has not moved. The plaster cast of his hand has not moved. The wind in the pines outside has not moved. The Queen sleeps on. The longest stretch of her sleep is the one between 4 and 6, that deep restorative stretch that comes when the first half of the night has worked the body free of the day. She is, in this stretch, in the kind of sleep that does not dream, or that does not dream remembered dreams. She is, for a brief uncomplicated stretch of the small hours, simply a body in a bed under a coverlet, in a room in a castle, in a valley, in a country that has known her name for 31 years, restored by the rhythm of breath and the warmth of bedclothes and the proximity of 2 sleeping dogs and the dark of the autumn night and the long Highland silence. She is 49. She has been queen since she was 18. She has been a widow for almost 7 years. She has, in the stretch of the night between 4 and 6, ceased for a while to be any of those things, and is only the small sleeping woman in the bed. Towards 5 in the village, the first lamp lights in a cottage window. It is the cottage of Robert Mitchell the gardener, who rises at 5 every morning of his working life to begin his day. He lights his candle, he puts on his trousers and his coat. He goes downstairs to his kitchen, where his wife has the fire already going, because she rose at 4 to bake the bread for the gardener's breakfast at the bothy. Robert sits at the table. His wife pours him a cup of tea from the brown pot. He drinks it. He eats a slice of fresh bread with butter. He goes out into the dark, with his lantern, on the half-mile walk up the drive to the gardens at the castle, where he and his under-gardeners will be at their work by 6. The lamp in his cottage is the first sign in the valley that the day will come. The night still holds, but the day is beginning to gather, somewhere beyond the eastern hills, in the way the day always gathers in the small hours. The Queen, in her bed, has another 2 hours before Mrs. MacDonald will come in with the hot water, and the day will begin in the room. She will sleep through them. The castle will sleep through them. The valley will sleep through them, except for Robert Mitchell on his way up the drive, and his wife in the cottage behind him, kneading the second batch of bread, and the kitchen scullery maid at the castle, who will be up at 5:30 to begin the morning fires. What we have been describing tonight is not only an evening, it is also a description of what this place was to the woman in the bed. Balmoral was the country she came to in order to be healed. She had been in it, as a wife with a husband for 9 summers before she lost him. She had been in it as a widow without him for 7 autumns since. Both versions of her life were in the rooms. The Highland country had absorbed her happiness with Albert in the years before he died, and it had absorbed her grief without him in the years after, and by the autumn of 1868, in a way she could not have phrased to anyone but knew in her bones, the country had begun to give her back something other than grief. The dogs at her feet, the walk to Crathy, the minister at the manse, the man down the road, the book she had published this January, which had reintroduced her to her own people, the warmth of being where she most wanted to be. None of it erased the loss, none of it ever would. But the country held the loss, the way a country can hold a loss, in the granite and the heather and the running water, and the woman who had once thought she could not survive him had survived him. The place had done that for her, and the place is still there. The granite is still there. The river still runs over its stones. The wind is still in the tops of the pines. The heather still rusts to copper in late September, and the curlew still passes over the moor at dusk, and the rain still comes down on the slates of the castle on the long autumn nights. You will not, in all likelihood, ever stand in the valley of the Dee in September of 1868. But you have stood in it tonight, in your imagination, for as long as I have been describing it, and the country we have been imagining together is the same country that did its slow work for the Queen who slept here 158 years ago, and it can do, in its own way, a little of that same slow work for you. Let the rain be on the slates of your roof tonight. Let the wind be in your trees. Let the granite of the castle hold the room you are lying in, the way it held the room she was lying in. That is a thing a place can do, across the centuries, for anyone willing to imagine themselves into it. It is one of the reasons we tell these stories at this hour. It is the only thing this story can offer you. But it is, I think, not nothing. You sleep too. You sleep the way the Queen is sleeping, the way the village is sleeping, the deep sleep of the small hours, the sleep that the day has earned, the sleep in which the body does its quiet repair of itself, and the mind does its quiet repair of itself, and the spirit, in its own small way, does its quiet repair of itself, and you wake in the morning lighter than you were the night before. Good night, my dear. The castle will keep through the night. The fire in your hearth will hold under its ash. The dogs will not stir. The wind in the pines will not change. The river will run past. The cattle in the home park will lie down, the deer on the high ground will feed and move on. Lochnagar will hold its dark place against the sky. The stars will run their slow great circle overhead. And you in your bed are part of all of it. You are in the same night the Queen is in. You are under the same Highland sky. You are warm. You are safe. Sleep. Sleep now. Sleep the way the castle is sleeping. Sleep the way the Highlands are sleeping. Sleep. Thank you for spending this evening at Balmoral with Queen Victoria. Thank you for letting me bring you inside the castle, and for letting these people, who were entirely real and who are entirely documented in the journals of the woman in the bed, be your company at the end of a long day. They are sleeping now. The castle is closed. The dogs are at the foot of her bed. The fire is banked. The frost is on the lawn. The stars are out over Lochnagar. Sleep well, wherever you are listening from. Sleep the way the Queen of England slept on a night in late September of 1868 in the castle, her husband built for her in the Highlands of Scotland, with the dogs at her feet and his dressing gown on the chair beside her, in the country she loved best in the world. I will see you in the next one.